This video gently explores the full story of King Solomon, the fourth ruler of ancient Israel and Judah, and the son of King David. He is remembered as a wise and wealthy prophet, known for building the first great temple in Jerusalem. The story follows his rise to power around the year 970 BCE, the height of his united kingdom, and the dramatic split that followed after his death. You will also hear about his wisdom, his devotion to God, and his mysterious reputation as a magician and spiritual master. In traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Solomon holds a special place as a teacher, a prophet, and a figure of legend. This documentary brings his full journey to life, from a young prince to a powerful ruler, and finally to a man remembered for both greatness and mystery. As you listen, let the gentle rhythm of ancient history carry you into peaceful rest. This is the story of Solomon, also called Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. He was the fourth monarch to rule over the united kingdom of Israel and Judah, as described in the ancient Hebrew Bible and other sacred texts. Solomon was the son and successor of King David, a man both celebrated and troubled in history. He is known as the penultimate ruler of the 12 tribes of Israel, before the kingdom eventually split. The reign of Solomon is believed to have lasted from around 970 years before the Common Era to approximately 931 years before the Common Era. His life story is one filled with wisdom, power, divine favor, and also deep mystery. Solomon's name carries many layers of meaning. Traditionally, his two names are interpreted as peaceful and friend of God. These meanings are seen as predictions of the character of his reign. Some scholars think the name Solomon could mean a substitute or compensation, perhaps reflecting his role as a replacement or continuation in the royal line. Others see Solomon as the ruler of peace, emphasizing his hoped-for role in bringing harmony to a divided land. There is even a theory that his name is linked to the ancient evening star, Shalem, a deity symbolizing peace and dusk in the Canaanite religion, which was known to the people of the region long before Solomon's time. The main stories of Solomon's life are recorded in several ancient books, including the second book of Samuel, the first book of Kings, and the second book of Chronicles. These texts paint a picture of a boy born into a powerful but complex royal family, growing up under the watchful eyes of priests, prophets, and kings. The kingdom he was born into was a united Israel and Judah, ruled by his father David, yet many challenges awaited young Solomon in his path to the throne. Solomon was born in the sacred city of Jerusalem. This city held great spiritual and political importance. It was a city built on hills and valleys, surrounded by ancient walls, temples, and palaces. The air would have been filled with the sounds of daily life, the calls of merchants, the prayers of priests, and the footsteps of soldiers. His mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah the Hittite. Solomon was their second child together. The first child, conceived under difficult circumstances, died shortly after birth. According to scripture, this was seen as a judgment from God for the actions that led to the childless conception. The story behind Solomon's birth is tied closely to one of the most famous and complex tales in the Bible, the story of King David's adultery with Bathsheba and the death of her first husband, Uriah. David, a man after God's own heart, but also a flawed human being, saw Bathsheba bathing one evening and was deeply moved by her beauty. Despite her being married to Uriah, David summoned her and they conceived a child. To cover up the situation, David called Uriah back from battle, hoping he would spend time with his wife and believe the child was his. But Uriah, a loyal soldier, refused to leave his fellow warriors and sleep at home while they were still in the field. Seeing this, David sent Uriah back to the battlefront with a letter instructing the commander, Joab, to place Uriah where the fighting was fiercest and then withdraw support so that Uriah would be killed. This grim order was carried out, and Uriah died in battle. After Uriah's death, David married Bathsheba. Their first child together died shortly after birth, which the scriptures say was a punishment for David's sin. After this, Solomon was born, a symbol of renewed hope and forgiveness. The name Solomon means peace, and it was chosen to represent this new beginning.
It was as if Solomon's life was a gift of reconciliation between God and King David, a peace offering for the troubled past. Solomon grew up in a large and complicated family. He had 3 full brothers born to Bathsheba, Athanshabu, and Shebab. In addition to these, he had at least 6 older half-brothers born to various wives of King David.
The royal household was filled with alliances, rivalries, and ambitions, each child growing up with their own hopes and challenges. Some scholars believe that Solomon's early education and upbringing were guided by the prophet Nathan. Nathan was a wise man and a trusted advisor to David. It is said that Nathan held great influence in the court, partly because he was aware of David's past sins and held a spiritual authority over the family. Imagine Solomon as a young boy growing up within the walls of the palace, surrounded by towering stone pillars, fragrant incense, and the quiet murmur of prayers. The palace was a place of both luxury and duty, where the boy learned the ways of kings, priests, and prophets. The young Solomon would have been taught the sacred laws, the history of his people, and the stories of their God, Yahweh. He would have listened to the chanting of the priests and watched the rituals at the temple. The weight of the future rested gently but firmly on his small shoulders. As the son of the king, Solomon's childhood was not one of simple play and freedom. It was a time filled with lessons about justice, leadership, and faith. He was raised to be more than just a prince. He was prepared to be a wise and powerful king, one who could unite his people and bring them peace. Solomon's story is not just a tale of royal birth and family drama. It is the beginning of a life that would leave an indelible mark on history, religion, and legend. As you listen now, imagine the soft flicker of torchlight in ancient Jerusalem. Hear the quiet footsteps in the palace halls. Feel the gentle breath of the evening breeze over the city. This is the world into which Solomon was born. A world waiting for a ruler, a teacher, a man of wisdom and peace. As Solomon grew older, the weight of his future role began to shape his days and nights. He was not just a prince living in a grand palace. He was a boy destined to carry the hopes of a united kingdom on his shoulders. The people of Israel and Judah looked toward the royal family with anticipation, waiting to see if peace and wisdom would continue in the next generation. The world around Solomon was a land of rich history and deep tradition. Jerusalem was the heart of this land, a city filled with ancient stone streets, bustling marketplaces, and sacred spaces dedicated to Yahweh, the God of Israel. The temple, though not yet built in Solomon's earliest years, was already a powerful symbol in the minds and hearts of the people. It represented a connection between heaven and earth, a place where prayers could reach the divine. Jerusalem in Solomon's youth was a vibrant and complex city. It was a center of religious life, political power, and cultural exchange. The city walls had been fortified under David's rule, protecting the inhabitants from external threats and internal strife. Markets would have been filled with merchants selling spices, textiles, pottery, and food from lands near and far. The sounds of haggling voices, the calls of vendors, and the rhythmic pounding of craftsmen filled the air. The presence of priests and Levites was strong in Jerusalem, overseeing the worship practices and the preservation of sacred texts. Religious festivals and sacrifices punctuated the year, binding the community together in faith. It was in this atmosphere of devotion and tradition that young Solomon's faith began to take root. Solomon's upbringing was likely filled with lessons from many teachers and advisors. Among these was the prophet Nathan, who remained a steady presence in the royal court. Nathan was not only a spiritual guide, but also a political counselor, a man who helped steer the young prince through the complexities of royal life. The role of the prophet in Solomon's time was vital. Prophets were seen as messengers of God, speaking truths that kings and common people alike needed to hear. Nathan's influence on Solomon may have been profound, preparing him for the immense responsibility of ruling a people who sought justice and peace. The biblical narratives, while focused on the spiritual and moral lessons, suggest that Solomon was a boy who received an education unlike many others in his time. He would have been taught the ancient laws of Israel, the stories of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the history of the people as they journeyed from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. In addition to religious education, Solomon's tutors likely taught him the arts of leadership and diplomacy. These lessons were essential for a prince who would one day govern a kingdom at the crossroads of powerful empires. Solomon's kingdom was surrounded by Egypt to the southwest, the powerful kingdoms of Aram and Assyria to the north and northeast, and the rising Babylonians to the east. Each of these neighbors presented both threats and opportunities. The art of maintaining peaceful relations, forging alliances through marriage, and engaging in trade would become a hallmark of Solomon's reign. These skills had to be learned early, during his formative years. Though the biblical texts give us limited details about Solomon's childhood, tradition and legend fill in some of the spaces. Solomon was said to be a boy of quiet intelligence, with a curiosity about the world and a deep sense of justice even in his youth. Stories tell us he was already wise beyond his years, a seed of the great wisdom he would later be known for. Growing up in a royal household, Solomon would have been surrounded by the symbols of power, ornate garments, shining jewelry, and the constant presence of guards and servants. Yet beyond these trappings, his education would have focused on understanding the laws of his people, the history of Israel, and the delicate balance of politics and faith. The kingdom itself was a mosaic of tribes and cultures, each with its own traditions and leaders. Holding this kingdom together required a leader not just strong in battle, but wise in counsel and fair in judgment. It was a heavy burden for a young boy to inherit, but Solomon was being prepared to bear it. The royal family lived in a world where power was deeply entwined with divine favor. Kings were seen as appointed by God, and their authority was both political and spiritual. Solomon's name, meaning peace or friend of God, was more than a name, it was a symbol of the role he was expected to play. As Solomon approached adulthood, the question of succession grew more pressing. King David, though aged and weary, still held the throne. Yet the time was coming when Solomon would be called upon to take up his father's mantle. David's final years were marked by both the consolidation of his kingdom and the challenge of maintaining order among his sons. Rivalries for power simmered beneath the surface, especially with his son Adonijah, who declared himself king before David had named Solomon his successor. The story of Solomon's rise is marked by both family loyalty and rivalry. In a royal family as large and complex as David's, the path to kingship was never certain or easy. Solomon's brothers and half-brothers each had their own claims and ambitions, and the court was a place of careful negotiation and alliance. Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and Nathan the prophet both played key roles in securing Solomon's claim to the throne. They approached David to remind him of his promise that Solomon would be king, persuading him to officially name Solomon as his successor. One of the most important moments in Solomon's early life was the promise of divine wisdom. The Bible tells us that Solomon's reign would be marked by a special gift from God, the ability to judge wisely and lead with understanding. This promise set him apart from other kings and made him a figure of hope for his people. This wisdom would become the cornerstone of Solomon's legacy. Stories of his wise judgments, his fair handling of disputes, and his deep understanding of law and human nature would echo through history. Solomon's early years were also shaped by the legacy of his father. David was a warrior king, a man who had united the tribes and established Jerusalem as the capital. But David's reign was also marked by personal failings and political challenges. Solomon inherited not only the kingdom, but also its complexities and unresolved tensions. The transition from prince to king required Solomon to learn quickly about leadership, diplomacy, and faith. He was being groomed to be a ruler who could balance power with mercy, strength with wisdom. The city of Jerusalem itself was a city on the rise, though David had established it as the capital. It was during Solomon's reign that Jerusalem would truly become a cultural and religious center. The vision of a great temple dedicated to Yahweh, which would one day dominate the city's skyline, was still taking shape in the minds of the people. As you imagine Solomon's world, picture the quiet moments in the palace gardens, where the young prince might have reflected on his future. Hear the soft rustling of olive trees and the distant sounds of the city. Feel the calm before the storm of history that was about to unfold. This was a time when the ancient world was filled with great empires and fierce battles. Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon were powerful neighbors, each with their own ambitions. Solomon's kingdom, though smaller, would need to navigate this complex landscape with skill and diplomacy. In these early years, Solomon was preparing not just in his mind but in his heart to be a king who could lead his people into a new era. A king who would be remembered for his wisdom, his building projects, and his commitment to his faith. The story of Solomon's birth and early life is more than just the tale of a prince. It is the beginning of a journey toward greatness, marked by promise, challenge, and the hope of peace. The story of how Solomon became king is one filled with intrigue, promise, and the shifting tides of power within a royal family that was as complex as it was large. Around 960 years before the Common Era, Solomon's journey from prince to monarch was shaped by political maneuvers. spiritual mandates, and the will of a kingdom hungry for peace and stability. At the heart of this tale stands King David, Solomon's father, a ruler renowned for uniting the 12 tribes of Israel and establishing Jerusalem as the capital city. David's reign was a time of great triumph and great trials. He was a warrior king, celebrated for his victories over Israel's enemies, and a unifier of a fragmented people. Yet, in the later years of his rule, uncertainty clouded the future. The question of who would succeed David weighed heavily upon the kingdom and his own household. Solomon was the son of Bathsheba, a woman whose story was itself woven with hardship and redemption. Bathsheba had been the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a soldier who died under tragic circumstances, the result of David's own missteps and remorse. From this union, Solomon was born, a child whose very name would come to symbolize peace, an echo of the reconciliation and hope that followed dark times. But Solomon was not the only son of David. The royal family was large and intricate, with many sons from multiple wives and concubines. Among them were older brothers who viewed the throne as their birthright, each with their own ambitions. The court was no simple place. It was a stage for alliances, rivalries, and subtle struggles for power. Among Solomon's half-brothers was Adonijah, the eldest surviving son, who believed he was the rightful heir. Adonijah's confidence in his claim was bolstered by supporters within the palace, including Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar, the high priest. These men held considerable influence and power, lending weight to Adonijah's bid for the throne. One day, Adonijah took a bold step. Without his father's approval or the consent of the people, he proclaimed himself king. In the ancient city of Jerusalem, where the stone walls echoed with the sounds of daily life and the prayers of the faithful, this declaration sent ripples of uncertainty and tension. Adonijah's self-coronation was not simply a challenge to his brothers. It was a challenge to the very order that David sought to uphold. The king, now in his old age, had long intended for Solomon to succeed him. Yet the palace was filled with whispers and plots, and Adonijah's actions threatened to unravel the fragile peace. In response, two key figures rose to protect Solomon's claim: Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and Nathan, the prophet and trusted advisor to King David. Nathan was more than a spiritual guide. He was a man who spoke with authority and courage, carrying messages believed to come directly from God. His voice was one of wisdom and warning. Bathsheba approached King David with grace and resolve. She reminded him of his promise, that Solomon, the son born after so much hardship, was to be the next king. Nathan supported her plea, emphasizing that the will of Yahweh, the God of Israel, favored Solomon's succession. David listened and acted. In a solemn ceremony filled with sacred ritual, he declared Solomon as his chosen successor. Anointed with oil by the priests, Solomon's kingship was consecrated, signifying that his reign was not merely a matter of bloodline or politics, but a divine appointment. This moment was monumental. The anointing of Solomon united the people's hopes and prayers behind him. It was a public affirmation that the young prince was to be the shepherd of Israel and Judah, entrusted with the sacred task of leadership. Jerusalem buzzed with renewed energy. Solomon's supporters gathered, rallying to his cause. The city's stone streets saw celebrations, while those loyal to Adonijah faced a sudden shift in fortune. The balance of power had changed, and the contest for the throne reached a critical turning point. Adonijah, unwilling to relinquish his claim, sought to secure his position by asking for the hand of Abishag, a woman who had served as a companion to King David. This request was more than a personal desire. It was a political maneuver. In ancient tradition, marrying a royal consort could strengthen one's claim to kingship. But Solomon, aware of the threat posed by Adonijah's ambitions, refused the request. He understood that allowing it might embolden his rival and destabilize the kingdom. In a decisive act, Solomon ordered that Adonijah be executed, a measure meant to preserve the peace and ensure the security of his reign. Solomon's rise to power was thus a story marked by political intrigue, familial tension, and the undeniable influence of divine will. Kingship in ancient Israel was regarded as a sacred trust, one that demanded wisdom, justice, and righteousness. The ceremonies that marked Solomon's anointing were rich in religious symbolism. Priests and Levites chanted prayers, prophets invoked blessings, and the entire nation witnessed the solemnity of the moment. It was a time when earthly rule and divine sanction intertwined, shaping the destiny of a people. Surrounding Solomon was a court of advisors and ministers, many of whom would play crucial roles in his reign. These men were learned in law, governance, and diplomacy, and they helped the young king navigate the complex realities of leadership. Beyond the palace walls, the political environment was fraught with challenges. Egypt, a powerful neighbor with ancient roots, kept a watchful eye on Israel. The kingdoms of Aram to the north and the growing Assyrian Empire presented additional diplomatic and military concerns. Solomon would need to balance these external pressures with internal governance. The 12 tribes of Israel and Judah were a mosaic of cultures and loyalties, each requiring careful management to maintain unity. Though much of Solomon's early reign is shrouded in mystery, the foundations he laid during this time would become the bedrock of a prosperous and influential kingdom. His focus on justice, wisdom, and the welfare of his people began to shape a new era. The transition from David to Solomon was not smooth or simple, but it was marked by the combination of political acumen and spiritual legitimacy. Solomon's path to kingship highlights the complexities of ancient monarchy, where family dynamics, religious faith, and political strategy were inseparable. As Solomon took the crown, the eyes of Israel and Judah were upon him. The hopes of a nation, weary from years of conflict, rested on the promise that this young king would lead them toward peace and prosperity. The story of how Solomon became king around 960 years before the Common Era is more than a tale of succession. It is a chapter in the history of a people seeking order, wisdom, and the blessings of their God. This was the beginning of Solomon's reign, a time that would set the stage for his legendary wisdom, his monumental building projects, and the diplomatic achievements that would echo through the ages. With the throne firmly in his hands, Solomon stepped into a role of immense responsibility and expectation. His coronation marked not only a victory in the fierce contest of power within his own family, but also the beginning of a new chapter for the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. The eyes of the nation were upon him, filled with hope and uncertainty, wondering if this young king could live up to the legacy of his father and bring peace to the land. The early days of Solomon's reign were a time of delicate balance. He needed to establish his authority firmly yet wisely, calming the lingering tensions that still simmered among the people and the royal court. Although Solomon had been anointed king with great ceremony and divine blessing, he was still a young man, learning what it meant to rule a diverse and sometimes divided kingdom. Around him stood seasoned counselors and advisors, each with their own loyalties and ambitions. Solomon had to earn their respect and secure their allegiance, knowing that any misstep could invite rebellion or unrest. One of Solomon's very first priorities was to deal with the unsettled political landscape left in the wake of his ascension. The rival factions that had supported his older half-brother, Adonijah, needed to be carefully managed. These supporters had been powerful Mensum warriors, others priests or nobles who had believed in Adonijah's claim to the throne. Solomon understood that ruling was not just about wielding power through force. It was about building trust and creating peace among his people. He could not afford to alienate entire groups who might feel wronged or excluded. So Solomon moved decisively but thoughtfully. Those who had backed Adonijah were given a choice. Some were invited to join Solomon's administration, offered positions of influence or honor if they swore loyalty to the new king. This showed Solomon's skill as a leader who valued reconciliation and inclusion. But others who remained disloyal or who posed a threat to the stability of the kingdom were removed from positions of power or, in rare cases, punished. This process was both necessary and precarious. Solomon had to walk a fine line. Too harsh, and he might spark rebellion. Too lenient, and his rule might be seen as weak. Even in these early days, Solomon's wisdom was becoming apparent. He showed a deep understanding of people and politics. Instead of ruling with fear and cruelty, he balanced firmness with mercy. This earned him respect not only from nobles but also from common people who hoped for justice and peace. The stories of his wise decisions and fair judgments began to spread, helping to cement his authority. At the heart of Solomon's leadership was a profound commitment to justice and righteousness. These were not just abstract ideals, but guiding principles for how he governed. Solomon believed that a king's power was a sacred trust given by God to serve the people and uphold what was right. His reputation for wise judgment quickly grew as tales of his fairness and insight were told in the marketplaces, synagogues, and palace halls. Beyond political consolidation, Solomon understood the vital importance of the support of religious leaders. The priests and Levites held great influence in society, as the spiritual well-being of the people was closely tied to the king's legitimacy. In a land where religion and governance were intertwined, maintaining a strong relationship with the temple and its caretakers was essential. At this time, the grand temple that Solomon would later build had not yet been constructed. However, Jerusalem was already the religious heart of the kingdom. The city was filled with sacred spaces, altars, and places where priests performed ceremonies and sacrifices. Solomon took great care to honor Yahweh, the God of Israel, ensuring that religious practices and festivals were observed with solemn reverence. This dedication not only pleased the people, but also reinforced his own authority as the king chosen by God. The prophet Nathan, who had been a trusted advisor to Solomon's father David, continued to play a significant role in Solomon's reign. Nathan's guidance extended beyond politics into matters of faith and morality. He reminded Solomon constantly of the divine covenant made with David, that Solomon's lineage was promised a lasting kingdom if he remained faithful to God's laws. This spiritual foundation deeply shaped Solomon's view of kingship. He understood that ruling was more than just managing people and resources. It was a sacred duty to lead his people in the ways of righteousness and to keep the covenant with God alive. As Solomon settled into power, he also began to look beyond his own borders. The ancient Near East was a complex and often dangerous region, filled with powerful empires and shifting alliances. Egypt to the southwest, Aram to the north, Phoenicia along the coast, and the rising power of Assyria all watched Israel carefully. Solomon knew that to protect his kingdom and ensure its prosperity, he had to navigate these external relationships with skill and diplomacy. To this end, Solomon began forging diplomatic ties. Marriages were an important part of this strategy. Solomon married foreign princesses, not only as personal unions, but as political alliances that would secure peace and cooperation with neighboring kingdoms. These marriages brought connections and influence, creating a web of relationships that helped Israel avoid unnecessary conflicts and open trade routes. Trade itself became a cornerstone of Solomon's reign. He invested in developing infrastructures such as roads and ports, making it easier for merchants to move goods. The kingdom's wealth grew as trade flourished, bringing prosperity to the cities and villages alike. Solomon encouraged commerce, knowing that economic strength would support the kingdom's political and military power. Despite these many achievements, Solomon's rule was not without challenges. Beneath the surface, tensions and dissents simmered. Governing a kingdom made up of diverse tribes and cultures required constant attention and wisdom. Solomon's leadership was tested repeatedly as he faced the demands of different groups, disputes over land and resources, and the ever-present threat of rebellion. One of the defining moments early in his reign was the gift of divine wisdom. According to ancient accounts, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and offered him anything he desired. Rather than asking for riches or power, Solomon humbly requested understanding and the ability to govern his people justly. Pleased with this request, God granted Solomon unparalleled wisdom, along with wealth and honor beyond measure. This divine blessing set Solomon apart from other rulers. His wisdom became legendary, attracting visitors and dignitaries from far-off lands, eager to witness the justice and insight of Israel's young king. Stories of Solomon's wise judgments, how he settled disputes with fairness and clarity, circulated widely, enhancing his authority and inspiring the faith of his people. As Solomon's rule became more secure, he began planning for the lasting legacy he hoped to leave. He envisioned a kingdom united, not only by politics but by shared faith, culture, and prosperity. Jerusalem, the heart of the kingdom, would be transformed into a magnificent capital, a symbol of Israel's strength and divine favor. The years following Solomon's rise to power were a time of transition and growth. His ability to manage internal family rivalries, engage with powerful neighbors, and nurture religious devotion reflected a king wise beyond his years. Solomon was no longer just a prince. He was a ruler shaping the destiny of a people, though the road ahead would bring many more challenges. Solomon's ascension around 960 years before the Common Era marked the beginning of a reign that would be remembered for wisdom, grandeur, and complexity. The story of how a young man stepped into the throne and became one of history's most renowned kings continues to inspire wonder to this day. The story of Solomon's reign takes a remarkable turn about 11 years into his rule, around 959. years before the Common Era, when a moment of profound significance shaped not only his life but the destiny of an entire kingdom. This was the time when Solomon, young king of Israel and Judah, was granted divine wisdom, a gift that would become the defining hallmark of his reign and echo through the ages. Imagine the young king standing at the crossroads of immense responsibility. Though Solomon had secured his throne and begun to govern with care and prudence, the burden of leadership weighed heavily upon his shoulders. He was tasked with ruling over 12 tribes, diverse in culture and custom, bound together yet often divided by old rivalries and new challenges. In this critical moment, Solomon's heart was sincere, and his mind was full of questions. How could he judge his people with fairness? How could he maintain peace where discord threatened? How could he build a kingdom that would honor God and inspire its people? Solomon's early years on the throne had already revealed the complex nature of his kingdom. The tribes that formed Israel and Judah were not always united by loyalty alone. Ancient tensions lingered beneath the surface, often requiring the hand of a wise ruler to balance competing interests and maintain order. These tribes each had their traditions, laws, and leaders who sometimes pushed back against the central authority of the king. The young monarch understood that ruling was not simply a matter of power, but of justice and mercy. The weight of his crown was a constant reminder that his decisions would affect thousands, even millions, of lives. His sense of responsibility was not lost on him, and it was in this moment of reflection that Solomon sought divine guidance. The ancient texts tell us that Solomon turned to Yahweh, the God of Israel, in humble prayer. It was not wealth or power he sought, but wisdom, understanding, to govern his people justly and to distinguish right from wrong. This prayer marked a turning point, a sacred dialogue between a king and his God. Solomon's request was unlike those of many kings before him, who often sought riches, military victories, or long life. Instead, Solomon's heart was fixed on the welfare of his people and the just administration of the kingdom. His prayer was one of humility and dedication, revealing a profound character shaped by both faith and foresight. During the night, as Solomon slept, God appeared to him in a dream, a moment filled with divine presence and deep meaning. In this dream, God offered Solomon anything he desired. The offer was vast: riches, long life, power over his enemies, or anything else a man might wish for. Yet Solomon's answer was remarkable. He asked not for riches or fame, but for wisdom, the ability to discern what was right and to govern his people with justice and fairness. He said that without such wisdom, his reign would be meaningless, and he would be unable to fulfill his duties as king. God was pleased with Solomon's request. Because of his selfless desire, God granted him not only great wisdom, but also wealth and honor, gifts that would far exceed what any other king had received. This blessing was a testament to Solomon's character and set the stage for an era remembered for wisdom, peace, and prosperity. This divine wisdom was not merely intellectual knowledge, but a deep understanding of human nature, justice, and the laws that govern life and society. It was a gift that would guide Solomon in making decisions that affected the lives of thousands and the fate of nations. In the days that followed, Solomon's wisdom became evident. Stories spread throughout the land and beyond, tales of his insightful judgments and the fairness of his rule. People came from distant lands to seek his counsel, eager to witness the wisdom that had been bestowed upon him by God. One famous example, though told later, illustrates this wisdom: the story of two women who came to Solomon with a dispute over a child. Solomon's clever judgment in this case revealed not only his sharp mind, but also his deep compassion and sense of justice. It was a glimpse into the kind of leader he was becoming. Solomon's gift of wisdom also extended beyond governance. He became known for his knowledge of the natural world, poetry, proverbs, and philosophy. The biblical texts credit him with writing many proverbs and songs, and his understanding of the world was admired far and wide. But this wisdom was also a great responsibility. Solomon knew that to maintain God's favor and the blessings he had received, he must remain faithful and just. The divine covenant required obedience and humility, and the king's wisdom would be tested by the many demands of leadership. The impact of Solomon's divine wisdom was profound. It shaped the laws of Israel, influenced the culture, and created a legacy that would inspire countless generations. His ability to rule with insight brought peace to a land once torn by conflict and united diverse tribes under a common purpose. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first consider the world into which Solomon was born. The ancient Near East was a place of competing empires, shifting alliances, and frequent wars. Egypt to the southwest, Assyria to the northeast, and the kingdoms of Aram and Phoenicia all vied for influence and control. For Solomon to keep his kingdom stable, he needed wisdom beyond that of mere mortal kings. Solomon's wisdom was seen as a divine gift precisely because it allowed him to navigate these treacherous political waters with skill. He was able to negotiate treaties, establish trade routes, and maintain peace with neighboring powers. His judgments were not only fair, but also strategic, ensuring that Israel's prosperity grew and its borders remained secure. At home, Solomon's wisdom influenced the development of a legal system that balanced the needs of the people with the authority of the crown. His laws emphasized justice and mercy, setting standards for judges and officials who would administer the kingdom. This system helped unify the diverse tribes and gave the people a sense of fairness and order. The wisdom of Solomon also touched cultural life. Under his reign, art, music, and literature flourished. The proverbs and songs attributed to him reveal a deep appreciation for the beauty and complexity of the world. Solomon's writings explore themes of morality, the human condition, and the search for meaning, offering guidance that would resonate through the ages. Religious life was central to Solomon's understanding of kingship. He knew that his wisdom came not only from his own mind, but from his relationship with Yahweh. Solomon's devotion was reflected in the way he honored the traditions and rituals of Israel. He maintained the religious festivals and the priestly duties that connected the people to their God. The temple in Jerusalem, which Solomon would later build, stood as a future symbol of this divine human relationship. Though the temple was not yet constructed at the time of his receiving wisdom, the vision of a sacred place where God's presence would dwell was already in his heart. Solomon's wisdom also called him to humility. He understood that his gifts were not for personal glory, but for the service of his people and the glory of God. This awareness tempered his decisions and guided his conduct as a ruler. Yet the story of Solomon's wisdom is not without its complexities. Later in his reign, challenges to his faith and leadership would arise, testing the strength of his commitment and the limits of his wisdom. The lessons learned from these trials would become part of the rich tapestry of his legacy. As we reflect on this pivotal chapter in Solomon's life, we are invited to consider the nature of true wisdom. It is not merely the accumulation of knowledge or cleverness, but the ability to understand, empathize, and act with justice and compassion. Solomon's gift reminds us that wisdom is a sacred trust, a guiding light for those who seek to lead with integrity. The moment when Solomon received divine wisdom was more than a personal blessing. It was the foundation of a reign that sought to balance power with mercy, ambition with humility, and strength with fairness. It set a standard for leadership that would inspire generations and shape the course of history. The echoes of this divine encounter reverberate through time, reminding us of the profound impact that wise and just leadership can have on the world. Solomon's story teaches us that true wisdom is born not of arrogance, but of a humble heart willing to serve the greater good. This chapter of history invites us to reflect deeply on the qualities that make a leader truly great. It challenges us to seek understanding beyond the surface, to value fairness over force, and to remember that the greatest gift a ruler can possess is the wisdom to govern with a just and compassionate heart. As Solomon's divine wisdom began to reveal itself through his actions and decisions, the kingdom of Israel and Judah entered a new era marked by peace and prosperity. This was not a peace born only of military might or political strategy, but a deeper, more enduring peace grounded in justice, fairness, and wise governance. Solomon's wisdom became evident in the way he handled disputes, large and small. The people came to him with their problems, seeking his judgment, confident that he would weigh each case with impartiality and insight. His reputation for fairness spread quickly, drawing visitors from distant lands, curious to witness the justice of Israel's young king. The judgments of Solomon were distinguished not only by their fairness, but by the king's ability to perceive deeper truths beneath surface disputes. His approach reflected a profound understanding of human nature and the social dynamics at play in conflict resolution. Solomon did not simply impose rulings. He sought to restore harmony and social order by addressing the root causes of disputes. One famous example involved two women who came to the king, each claiming to be the mother of the same child. The dispute was painful and complex, with both women insisting on their rights. Solomon listened carefully to their testimonies and proposed a solution both shocking and insightful. He suggested cutting the child in two, offering half to each woman. The true mother immediately begged the king to spare the child's life and give him to the other woman. Solomon then declared her the rightful mother, recognizing her willingness to sacrifice for the child's well-being. This judgment not only resolved the conflict, but revealed Solomon's profound understanding of human nature and love. Beyond individual judgments, Solomon's wisdom shaped the kingdom's legal framework and social customs. He worked to create legal codes that balanced justice with mercy, reflecting the values taught by the prophets and the traditions of the Israelites. His laws became the foundation of civil order, influencing the judges and officials who governed the land's daily affairs. These legal reforms established clear standards for conduct in areas ranging from property rights and commerce to family relations and criminal justice. Solomon's laws promoted fairness, accountability, and the protection of the vulnerable, strengthening societal cohesion and trust among the people. Culturally, Solomon's reign was a golden age. His wisdom extended to the arts, literature, and sciences. The proverbs attributed to Solomon contain timeless truths about life, morality, and the human spirit. These sayings captured the essence of wisdom not just as intellectual knowledge, but as practical guidance for living well. Solomon was a patron of scholars, poets, and artisans who contributed to a flourishing cultural environment. This intellectual vibrancy nurtured a tradition of reflection on ethical behavior, spirituality, and human purpose, which continued to influence subsequent generations. Architecturally, Solomon's vision materialized in grand building projects, though his temple in Jerusalem would be constructed later. The early years of his reign saw the foundation laid for a capital city that would reflect the glory and unity of the kingdom. Palaces, storehouses, and fortifications rose under his direction, demonstrating a combination of artistic vision and practical governance. These constructions were not only symbols of power, but served vital administrative and economic functions. The infrastructure improvements facilitated trade, improved security, and enhanced the kingdom's ability to manage resources efficiently. Religiously, Solomon's wisdom deepened the connection between the monarchy and the divine. He understood that his role as king was also a spiritual vocation. His dedication to Yahweh shaped the rituals, festivals, and priestly functions that united the people in worship and identity. Solomon's reign saw the centralization of religious practices, strengthening the temple's role as the heart of Israelite spiritual life. This centralization fostered unity and reinforced the covenantal relationship between the people and their God. Solomon's wisdom extended to international relations as well. Through shrewd diplomacy, he forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms, including marriages to foreign princesses that strengthened ties and brought peace. These alliances allowed Israel to flourish economically and culturally, creating networks of trade and exchange. The establishment of peaceful diplomatic relations with powerful neighbors reduced the threat of invasion and opened new opportunities for commerce and cultural exchange. Israel became a hub of regional interaction, benefiting from the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies. The gifts of wealth and honor that accompanied Solomon's wisdom were visible in the splendor of his court. Foreign dignitaries, such as the Queen of Sheba, traveled great distances to witness the king's wisdom and wealth firsthand. Their visits highlighted Solomon's reputation as a ruler unlike any other, man blessed by God to lead with insight and grace. These diplomatic encounters enhanced Israel's prestige and helped to secure its influence beyond its borders. The exchange of gifts and knowledge during these visits enriched the kingdom's cultural and intellectual life. Yet Solomon's wisdom was not merely about grandeur or fame. It was about service to his people and faithfulness to the divine covenant. He knew that his blessings came with great responsibility. The divine covenant required that he remained humble, just, and obedient to God's laws. This sense of duty guided Solomon's governance. His reign was marked by a careful balance between authority and accountability, recognizing that legitimate power stems from righteous stewardship rather than mere force. As his reign continued, Solomon faced new challenges that tested the limits of his wisdom. The diverse kingdom required constant attention and delicate balancing of competing interests. While his wisdom brought peace, it also revealed the complexities of human nature and governance. Maintaining unity across various tribes and cultures demanded diplomacy, flexibility, and foresight. Solomon's policies had to accommodate different customs and traditions while promoting a cohesive national identity. Some critics and historians note that Solomon's later years showed signs of struggle with these demands. His many marriages and foreign alliances brought cultural influences that sometimes conflicted with the religious traditions of Israel. Yet these complexities serve to remind us that wisdom, even divine wisdom, must constantly be renewed and applied with care. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Solomon's divine wisdom endures. His reign became a symbol of the ideal ruler, one who leads not only with power, but with a heart attuned to justice and compassion. The wisdom literature attributed to him continues to inspire those who seek guidance in life and leadership. The biblical narrative, along with historical and cultural traditions, preserves the memory of Solomon as a king who embodied the highest ideals of leadership. His gift of wisdom was both a personal blessing and a public trust, shaping the destiny of his people and leaving a mark on history that has lasted millennia. As we conclude this chapter of Solomon's story, the moment of receiving divine wisdom in 959 before the Common Era, we see the beginnings of a reign that would be remembered for its balance of strength and mercy, ambition and humility, law and compassion. This pivotal moment invites us to reflect on the true nature of wisdom and leadership. It challenges us to consider that the greatest power lies not in force or wealth, but in the ability to govern with understanding, justice, and a heart dedicated to the well-being of all. The story of Solomon's divine wisdom continues to echo through history as a beacon of hope for those who dream of leaders who rule with fairness and insight. It reminds us that wisdom is a gift to be cherished, nurtured, and applied with care for the good of all. This chapter closes with the image of a young king standing at the threshold of greatness, guided by divine light and human compassion, ready to lead his people toward an era of peace and prosperity. The legacy of Solomon's wisdom is a timeless reminder of the power of faith, humility, and just leadership. The period between 957 and 950 BCE marks one of the most monumental architectural and religious undertakings in the history of ancient Israel, namely the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the significant expansion and development of the city itself. This era, under King Solomon's reign, represents the fulfillment of extensive political, religious, and cultural ambitions that aimed to establish Jerusalem as the spiritual, administrative, and political center of the United Kingdom. The magnitude of this project extended beyond mere construction to a profound reshaping of Israel's identity, governance, and religious expression, setting a precedent that would resonate throughout the region and for generations to come. The decision to construct a permanent temple dedicated to Yahweh was transformative for the Israelite nation. This project transcended mere architecture to become a unifying religious endeavor designed to centralize worship and consolidate the diverse tribes of Israel around a singular national sanctuary. The temple was intended as a tangible representation of the covenant between the people and their God, embodying divine presence, authority, and blessing within its sacred walls. Prior to this moment, worship had often been decentralized, with various high places and local shrines scattered throughout the land, reflecting a more fragmented religious landscape. Solomon's temple sought to unify these practices, giving a fixed sacred space where religious rites, festivals, and sacrifices could be performed in accordance with a standardized form, thereby reinforcing both faith and national cohesion. Prior to Solomon's reign, Jerusalem was a modestly sized city, strategically positioned on the border between the tribal lands of Judah and Benjamin. Its location offered military advantage and control over important trade routes. However, it lacked the infrastructure and grandeur expected of a capital city for a united kingdom. The city's natural defenses were notable, with its position on a hill providing protection, but its fortifications were still limited compared to the ambitions Solomon held for it. Solomon envisioned a comprehensive transformation that would not only expand Jerusalem's physical boundaries, but also enhance its fortifications, roads, administrative buildings, and public spaces to reflect its elevated status as the kingdom's heart. This vision was as much about symbolism as it was about practical governance, intending to create a capital that would inspire awe, command respect, and serve as a center of power and worship. The scale and complexity of the construction process were unprecedented, mobilizing vast numbers of skilled laborers, artisans, craftsmen, and general workers required extensive planning and administrative oversight. Solomon's governance demonstrated an ability to organize resources efficiently, directing the workforce in a manner that ensured the steady progress of the various building projects. The labor force likely included conscripted workers drawn from the Israelite population, as well as specialists and craftsmen possibly recruited from allied or neighboring peoples, reflecting the kingdom's diplomatic connections. These workers included stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers, and artists whose combined skills were essential to realize the grandeur of the project. The coordination needed to manage supply chains, ensure timely delivery of materials, and maintain quality control across the various construction sites underscored Solomon's administrative sophistication. Material acquisition for the temple and related constructions was a major undertaking. High-quality timber, especially cedar wood imported from the forests of Lebanon, was prized for its durability and fragrance. Cedar was particularly valued not only for its physical properties but also for its symbolic associations with strength and holiness. Stone was quarried from local sites, ensuring strength and stability, while precious metals including gold and silver were obtained through tribute payments and trade. These metals adorned the temple's interior furnishings and ritual objects, underscoring the sacredness and wealth associated with the sanctuary. The use of such valuable materials underscored the importance of the temple project, as well as the economic prosperity of Solomon's reign. It also reflected the extensive trade networks Israel had established, linking it to distant regions and peoples. Architecturally, the temple incorporated design elements influenced by neighboring cultures. Phoenician, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian motifs and construction techniques found their way into the temple's design. For example, Phoenician artisans were reputed for their expertise in woodwork and metalwork, and their influence likely contributed to the temple's intricate details. Egyptian artistic styles influenced symbolic carvings and decorations, while Mesopotamian architectural concepts helped inform the temple's overall structure and layout. Yet these influences were carefully adapted to conform with Israelite religious beliefs and ritual practices. The layout of the temple emphasized symbolic geometry and functional spaces that facilitated worship and priestly rites, distinguishing it from other contemporary religious structures in the region. This careful blending of foreign artistic elements with Israelite religious identity created a unique sacred space that was both connected to the wider ancient Near Eastern world and distinctively national. The temple complex was composed of several key areas. The innermost sanctuary, known as the Holy of Holies, housed the Ark of the Covenant, symbolizing Yahweh's presence. This space was the most sacred, accessible only to the high priest and only on the Day of Atonement, emphasizing the separation between the divine and ordinary worshippers. The holy place contained altars, sacred objects, and space for priestly duties, including offerings and ritual preparations. The outer courts allowed access to the wider community for certain ritual observances and festivals, creating a tiered structure of access and participation in worship. This spatial arrangement reflected the hierarchical nature of Israelite worship and the separation between the divine and the human. It also reinforced social and religious order, symbolizing the relationship between God, priests, and the people. Solomon's architectural achievements extended beyond the temple to include a royal palace complex, administrative offices, storerooms, and military fortifications. These additional structures supported the administrative and defensive needs of the kingdom, facilitating effective governance and the maintenance of internal order. The royal palace not only served as the king's residence, but also as a center for court functions and diplomatic receptions. Storerooms were essential for managing the kingdom's resources, including grain, oil, and wine, ensuring economic stability and the capacity to support large projects and armies. Military fortifications, including walls and gates, protected Jerusalem and projected the strength of the kingdom. The expansion of infrastructure included improvements in water management, such as the construction of cisterns and channels to secure a reliable water supply, road construction to improve trade and communication, and urban planning, which collectively enhanced the livability and security of Jerusalem. Massive walls and city gates were constructed to protect the city from external threats. These fortifications served both practical defensive purposes and symbolic functions, representing the strength, unity, and permanence of Solomon's reign. The walls were engineered to withstand sieges and assaults, incorporating watchtowers and fortified gates. Jerusalem was thus transformed from a modest town into a formidable capital city capable of withstanding military challenges and serving as a seat of political power. This transformation also sent a clear message to neighboring kingdoms and internal factions about the stability and might of Solomon's rule. The construction of the temple and urban development projects had wide-ranging economic impacts. The demand for raw materials, labor, and specialized skills stimulated quarrying, carpentry, metalworking, and long-distance trade. Industries thrived as the kingdom allocated resources to sustain the building campaigns. The influx of workers and the need for supplies stimulated local economies and fostered new trade relationships. However, the mobilization of labor and resources required careful balance to prevent excessive strain on the population, ensuring the projects advanced without causing social unrest. Solomon's administration likely implemented policies to manage conscription, resource allocation, and taxation to maintain this delicate equilibrium. Alongside physical construction, religious reforms were implemented to centralize and standardize worship in Jerusalem. The establishment of the temple as the focal point of Yahweh worship consolidated priestly authority and ritual practices. This centralization sometimes created tension with regional shrines and local cultic traditions, as it challenged long-standing religious practices. Nevertheless, it ultimately reinforced a unified religious identity that supported national cohesion and helped solidify the concept of a single God with a designated sanctuary. This religious centralization was critical in uniting the tribes culturally and spiritually under Solomon's reign. Solomon's dual role as political monarch and divinely chosen builder linked the authority of the throne with spiritual legitimacy. The temple stood as a monument to this connection, reinforcing the idea that the king ruled not only by human right but under divine sanction. This fusion of political and religious power strengthened Solomon's position and contributed to the stability and prestige of his reign. The temple became not only a place of worship but a symbol of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, with Solomon as the chosen intermediary. The grandeur and scale of Solomon's building projects reflected the kingdom's zenith in terms of wealth, influence, and cultural achievement. Jerusalem under Solomon became more than a political capital. It was a symbol of divine favor, national pride, and religious devotion. The temple was a focal point for pilgrimage, worship, and political ceremony, embodying the kingdom's aspirations and its relationship with Yahweh. It attracted visitors and emissaries from distant lands, further elevating Israel's status on the regional stage. The construction of the temple and the transformation of Jerusalem established foundations that would shape Israelite culture, religion, and governance for centuries to come. The complex interplay of architectural innovation, administrative organization, economic development, and religious centralization during this period marked a defining chapter in the history of ancient Israel and left a lasting legacy that influenced subsequent generations. The echoes of Solomon's temple would endure through religious texts, historical memory, and ongoing cultural identity, making this era one of profound and enduring significance. The construction of Solomon's temple was not merely an architectural achievement, but a profound expression of religious devotion and political power. Every aspect of the temple's design was carefully considered to reflect the sacred relationship between Yahweh and the people of Israel. The use of symbolic dimensions, the placement of ritual objects, and the choice of materials all contributed to creating a space that was both majestic and spiritually significant. The craftsmen and laborers involved in the project were highly skilled and organized with great precision. Skilled artisans specialized in wood carving, metalworking, stonemasonry, and textiles, bringing diverse expertise to the worksite. Phoenician craftsmen, renowned for their artistry and technical knowledge, were likely invited to contribute, particularly in areas requiring intricate detail, such as the temple's ornamental carvings and metal fixtures. The workforce was divided into groups, each overseen by experienced supervisors who ensured that work proceeded smoothly and met the high standards required. This hierarchical organization reflected the advanced administrative abilities of Solomon's government and the importance placed on the temple's timely completion. Material acquisition for the temple was a vast and complex undertaking. Cedar timber, prized for its strength and aroma, was imported from the forests of Lebanon, requiring long-distance trade and skilled transportation. Large quantities of quarried stone were extracted from nearby sites, carefully shaped and transported to Jerusalem. Precious metals such as gold and silver were gathered through tribute and trade, reflecting the kingdom's wealth and international connections. These resources were used not only for construction, but also for the temple's interior decorations, including gold-plated walls, bronze furnishings, and ceremonial objects. The careful selection and use of these materials underscored the temple's sacred status and the importance of honoring Yahweh with the finest offerings. The political implications of the temple's construction were significant. As a unifying symbol, the temple solidified Solomon's authority and reinforced Jerusalem's role as the kingdom's religious and political center. The temple attracted visitors and dignitaries from across the ancient Near East, including the famous visit of the Queen of Sheba, which highlighted Solomon's reputation for wisdom and wealth. Diplomatic alliances formed through marriage and trade were supported by the grandeur of the temple, which served as a testament to the strength and legitimacy of Solomon's reign. This monumental building project thus played a vital role in shaping the regional power dynamics and enhancing Israel's standing among neighboring states. The economic effects of the construction were far-reaching. The demand for raw materials, labor, and craftsmanship stimulated various sectors of the economy, including mining, forestry, metallurgy, and transportation. Local industries prospered as they supplied the necessary goods and services to sustain the building efforts. However, managing such a large-scale project also required careful resource allocation to avoid overtaxing the population. The labor force likely included a combination of conscripted workers and paid specialists, ensuring that the burden was distributed while maintaining the quality and pace of work. Solomon's administration demonstrated considerable skill in balancing ambition with sustainability, a crucial factor in the successful completion of the temple and related infrastructure. Religiously, the temple's centralization of worship had profound consequences. By establishing a single, nationally recognized sanctuary, Solomon's reforms strengthened the priesthood and standardized ritual practices across the kingdom. This centralization helped unify the diverse tribes of Israel, fostering a shared religious identity that supported political cohesion. At the same time, it sometimes created tensions with regional shrines and local traditions as the focus shifted to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the temple became the spiritual heart of Israel, hosting important festivals, sacrifices, and ceremonies that reinforced the covenant between Yahweh and his people. It became a place where individuals and the community as a whole could connect with the divine in a tangible and meaningful way. Solomon's dual role as monarch and divinely appointed builder embodied the fusion of political and spiritual authority. The temple was more than a physical structure. It was a symbol of God's presence among the people and the king's responsibility to uphold divine law. This connection legitimized Solomon's rule and elevated the status of the monarchy. It established a model for future kings, emphasizing the inseparability of religious devotion and political leadership. The temple's presence in Jerusalem thus anchored the kingdom's identity and reinforced its stability during Solomon's reign. The grandeur and scale of Solomon's building projects marked the apex of Israel's power and cultural achievement. Jerusalem was transformed from a modest border city into a flourishing capital that impressed both its inhabitants and foreign visitors. The temple itself stood as a beacon of divine favor and national pride, attracting pilgrims and dignitaries alike. Political ceremonies and religious festivals held within its courts solidified social bonds and demonstrated the unity of the kingdom. Through architecture, administration, and worship, Solomon's Jerusalem became a city that embodied the aspirations and values of his reign. The legacy of Solomon's temple and the urban transformation of Jerusalem endured far beyond his lifetime. Although the temple was eventually destroyed and rebuilt, its significance remained central to Jewish religious life and identity. The architectural innovations and administrative strategies developed during this period influenced subsequent rulers and neighboring cultures. Solomon's example of linking political power with spiritual authority set important precedents for governance and legitimacy. His building program showcased the complexity and sophistication of ancient Israelite society, highlighting its capacity for innovation and cultural expression. Furthermore, the comprehensive urban planning that accompanied the temple's construction reflected a deep understanding of sustainable city development. Improvements in water management, including cisterns and aqueducts, ensured a reliable supply for Jerusalem's growing population. Roads and gates were expanded and fortified, enhancing both defense and commerce. Public buildings and storehouses supported the administrative functions necessary for maintaining order and supporting the economy. Together, these developments created a capital city equipped to serve as the heart of a united and prosperous kingdom. In conclusion, Solomon's construction of the temple and the development of Jerusalem represented a defining moment in ancient Israel's history. This monumental project combined religious devotion, political strategy, economic management, and architectural innovation to create a lasting symbol of the kingdom's identity and aspirations. The temple stood as a physical manifestation of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, while the city's transformation reflected the ambitions of a wise and powerful king. The enduring influence of these achievements continues to be felt in the cultural and religious heritage of the region to this day. The reign of King Solomon marked an era unlike any before it in the ancient history of Israel. A time when the kingdom was not only strong in spirit, but flush with wealth, interconnected with the surrounding world through trade, diplomacy, and shared ambitions. Following the monumental construction of the temple, Solomon's vision extended beyond the spiritual center of his people. He understood that the stability and prosperity of his kingdom would not come from temples and palaces alone, but from the bustling flow of goods, alliances, and ideas. Solomon presided over a land that lay at the crossroads of great civilizations. To the west lay the Mediterranean Sea, a watery highway connecting the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, and beyond. To the east, desert trade routes wound their way toward Mesopotamia and Arabia. The king took full advantage of this geographical blessing, forging ties with distant nations and opening channels for commerce that would enrich his people and fortify his reign. He was no mere provincial ruler. He was a merchant king, a diplomat sovereign, whose reach and reputation grew far beyond Jerusalem's golden walls. Solomon's most notable trading partnership was with Hiram, the king of Tyre, whose Phoenician people were masters of the sea and of skilled craftsmanship. This alliance was built on mutual respect and shared benefit. From Tyre came cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon, the finest timber in the ancient world, used not only in the temple, but in the construction of royal buildings and homes of nobility. The Phoenicians also provided skilled laborers, artisans, and sailors. In return, Solomon supplied them with wheat and olive oil, precious staples grown in abundance in the Judean highlands. This partnership soon blossomed into a broader maritime collaboration. Together, they launched a fleet of ships from Ezion-Geber, a port near the Red Sea, believed to be located in what is now modern-day Jordan, or Israel's southern tip. These ships set sail for the mysterious land of Ophir, a place shrouded in legend, possibly located along the Arabian coast, the Horn of Africa, or even India. The voyages brought back gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. These exotic goods dazzled the courts of Jerusalem and elevated its status among the powerful kingdoms of the region. But Solomon's ambitions did not end with material gain. He was also deeply invested in diplomacy and securing peace through relation building. Unlike his father David, whose reign was marked by war and conquest, Solomon preferred the pen to the sword. He entered into marriages with foreign princesses, not simply for personal pleasure, but to secure peace and stability. These unions, though controversial in religious terms, served as political alliances that stitched together a vast and diverse network of loyalty, understanding, and influence. Egypt, once an enemy, became a partner when Solomon married the pharaoh's daughter, cementing an unprecedented relationship between two ancient powers. The influx of wealth led to massive infrastructure projects. Solomon ordered the building of palaces, administrative buildings, storage cities, fortresses, and roads. He fortified key trade routes, ensuring goods could move safely and efficiently across his territories. Toll stations may have been placed along these roads, collecting fees from caravans that passed through, adding yet more treasure to the royal treasury. These initiatives did more than just display wealth. They created jobs, improved the lives of citizens, and bound the kingdom together through commerce and travel. The king's officials carefully organized trade networks, both domestic and international. Solomon divided the land into administrative districts, each responsible for providing provisions to the royal court. This clever system ensured a steady flow of resources and allowed Solomon to focus his energies on expansion and diplomacy. Merchants from distant lands were welcomed into the markets of Jerusalem. Languages, customs, and coins from distant lands became common sights. The people began to taste the richness of the world beyond their borders. However, the sudden rise of wealth brought with it growing challenges. While the elite basked in luxury, the common people began to feel the weight of the royal machine. High taxes and conscripted labor slowly began to stir discontent, though this would not fully erupt until after Solomon's death. For now, the Gilded Age marched on, its surface gleaming with gold and fine linen, though cracks slowly appeared beneath. Solomon also sought wisdom and knowledge beyond his borders. He corresponded with scholars, listened to travelers, and welcomed the learned men of other lands. The fame of his wisdom, which had begun with a divine gift, now spread by word of mouth from caravan to caravan. Delegations from Arabia, Africa, and Anatolia came to witness his court, bringing gifts and questions. Jerusalem became not only a center of commerce, but a hub of ideas and diplomacy. Among the most famed visitors was the Queen of Sheba, whose arrival would be detailed later, but whose connection was rooted in this period of open borders and international dialogue. Her visit was not an isolated event, but part of a broader phenomenon. As Solomon's fame drew kings and queens from faraway lands, each curious to see the splendor of the man who had made peace more powerful than war. As Solomon's network of alliances expanded, so too did the influence of Israel. The nation was no longer just a kingdom among many, but had become a player on the grand stage of ancient politics and trade. Spices from Arabia, horses from Egypt, fabrics from Phoenicia, and metals from the mines of distant lands flowed into the treasury. Temples, courts, and festivals glowed with this wealth, and the name of Solomon became synonymous with divine favor and human prosperity. And yet, beneath the brilliance of imported gold and the perfume of foreign incense, murmurs of growing burdens began to rise among the people. What began as opportunity was becoming expectation. The king's reach grew longer, his policies more demanding. The seeds of future unrest lay dormant but planted, quietly awaiting their season. Still, the image of Solomon's court during this era was one of unmatched beauty and prestige. His throne, said to be made of ivory and overlaid with gold, stood as a symbol of his unmatched status. His royal guard shimmered in ceremonial attire. Scribes, priests, diplomats, and merchants all moved through the palace in rhythmic harmony, each playing their part in the great machine of Solomon's Israel. And at the center of it all stood the king, not as a warrior, but as a bridge between worlds. As the years passed and the wheels of trade turned ceaselessly, the kingdom grew ever richer. From the halls of Jerusalem to the outer edges of the empire, Solomon's policies reshaped the region. His court was both a marketplace and a throne room, a house of knowledge and a seat of power. And yet, the second half of this chapter will begin to explore the depth of these relations, the complexity behind each alliance, the tension beneath each transaction, and the eventual toll that wealth and ambition would begin to exact on the fragile structure of the kingdom itself. The golden age of Solomon's reign did not merely glisten in the reflected glory of gold and spices. It stood as a testament to the ambition and coordination of a kingdom that had mastered the intricate game of regional influence, one where diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchanges flowed like the waters of the Jordan River, shaping not only the internal prosperity of Israel, but also its reputation among neighboring powers. As ships returned to the ports of Ezion-Geber near Elath, their hulls laden with exotic cargoes from distant lands, they brought more than materials they carried: ideas, artifacts, languages, tools, and skills, slowly transforming the identity of a people who had once been defined by desert wanderings and tribal wars, now reborn under a monarch who saw wisdom not as static truth, but as something that traveled, evolved, and expanded through contact and commerce. From the distant land of Ophir, the voyages sponsored by Solomon's fleet became legendary, not merely for the wealth they returned, but for the logistical marvel they represented. These were expeditions that required navigation, knowledge, provisioning, route mapping, and port coordination, and while the biblical record gives glimpses rather than full accounts, later traditions speak of voyages stretching across the Red Sea, and perhaps even toward the coasts of southern Arabia or the Horn of Africa, regions where gold, ivory, apes, and peacocks were plentiful. Every returning vessel strengthened the monarchy's treasury, but more importantly, it reinforced the impression that Israel was no longer a passive player on the fringes of empire, but a dynamic and respected kingdom whose navy and merchantmen could match those of older powers, this economic engine was powered by more than sea trade. Solomon's kingdom became a center of overland trade as well, with caravans crossing the Judean highlands, connecting Egypt to the great Mesopotamian centers, stopping at fortified outposts and store cities built under the king's orders. Cities like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer were not only strategic fortresses, but also hubs of regional commerce, with weighing stones, scales, granaries, and administrative tablets discovered by archaeologists testifying to the complex bureaucracy that kept goods flowing and taxes recorded. Wealth poured into the capital from foreign envoys and tribute missions. Solomon's court became a magnet for kings, queens, and emissaries eager to secure treaties, exchange gifts, or simply observe the mysterious monarch whose reputation had grown even among distant peoples. It was in this context that the famous visit of the Queen of Sheba took place. Her arrival not just a personal curiosity, but a diplomatic mission aimed at evaluating the possibilities of trade, alliance, or at least mutual understanding. Legends would later speak of their exchanges as filled with riddles, poetic wisdom, and mutual respect, but behind the dramatic embellishments was a pattern repeated across the Near East. Rulers traveling or sending trusted agents to assess the strength and worthiness of others. Solomon's court dazzled her with its order, prosperity, and ritual, with the Temple of Yahweh and the royal palace acting as dual centers of religious and political gravity. Beyond such high-profile visits were dozens of less documented relationships. Solomon is believed to have solidified alliances through marriages, a common political tool of the time, one that turned distant kings into in-laws and once wary neighbors into brothers. This practice was controversial, particularly in later religious reflections, but at the time, it was understood as a practical and effective means of binding peoples together. These unions brought with them new influences, languages, customs, and gods. The court of Solomon likely became a cosmopolitan space where Phoenician merchants, Egyptian scribes, Edomite laborers, and Aramean artisans crossed paths with priests and elders. An arena where the sacred and the secular mingled without fixed boundaries. A fertile environment for both flourishing creativity and emerging tensions. The internal economy thrived under such conditions, with artisans, masons, scribes, and traders benefiting from the abundance of materials and demand for luxury. Temple service required skilled labor in embroidery, metalwork, and incense preparation, while the palace employed architects, administrators, and guards. Rural areas sent their produce and livestock as tithe or tax, and urban centers grew in population and specialization. A network of prosperity connected city to village, sea to mountain, altar to throne. The broader Levantine world was undergoing shifts as well, and Solomon's Israel had to remain agile. Assyria and Babylon were not yet at the peak of their imperial power, but Egypt remained a force to reckon with, often playing smaller states against each other to maintain influence. Solomon's balanced diplomacy managed to avoid direct conflicts, preserving stability through mutual interest and careful negotiation. However, beneath the surface of this golden age, strains began to show. For every shipment of golden cedar that entered Jerusalem, there were farmers in the north groaning under forced labor levies. For every alliance secured through marriage, there were elders questioning the erosion of cultural purity. The very success of Solomon's foreign policies created new complexities, especially as foreign wives brought their gods into the capital, and foreign customs found their way into daily life. The priests of Yahweh grew uneasy, their temple gleaming in the sun. Yes, but surrounded now by competing altars and shrines, constructed to honor deities not native to the children of Israel. And although Solomon himself maintained his rituals, the blending of traditions sparked quiet discontent among the devout. A conflict, not yet open, but slowly simmering in the hearts of those who feared the covenant, was being diluted by diplomacy. Still, Solomon's reign remained unchallenged for now, and the machinery of state operated with remarkable efficiency. Records were kept, taxes collected, projects completed, alliances honored, and festivals observed. The king stood at the center of it all, a figure both revered and watched, a leader whose wisdom had become his brand, and whose policies had made Israel not just prosperous, but respected, even envied. As the years drew on, the kingdom's identity continued to evolve, balancing its ancient tribal roots with its newly acquired cosmopolitanism, navigating the tension between inherited faith and acquired influence. between the longing for divine favor and the lure of earthly success. It was in these years that the seeds of future conflict were quietly planted, not in open rebellion or foreign invasion, but in the subtle erosion of unity, a splintering not yet visible, but felt by those who listened closely. Solomon, surrounded by wealth and wisdom, may have sensed this shift, or perhaps he believed that the strength of the institutions he built, the temple, the throne, the alliances, would endure long beyond his death, and for a time it seemed they would. The world saw a king at the height of his glory, a city filled with wonder, and a people basking in peace. But as history would show, golden ages gleam brightest just before they fade. And thus concludes chapter 5, a chapter of trade routes and tribute, of wisdom and wealth, of diplomacy and complexity, where Solomon's vision elevated a kingdom into the annals of world history, not only for its spiritual significance, but for the sheer brilliance of its global reach and domestic mastery. In the chapters that follow, we will begin to sense the weight of legacy and the cost of decisions made in prosperity. But for now, the age of Solomon still shines, its echoes carried in gold and cedar, in alliances inked with wisdom, and in the unspoken knowledge that even the greatest empires are only ever moments in time. Following the years of prosperity and architectural achievement during the height of Solomon's reign, the focus of his leadership shifted more prominently towards matters of justice, law, and the administration of moral order within the kingdom. The era of judicial wisdom, which flourished around 940 before the Common Era, marked a defining period in Solomon's reputation as a ruler whose discernment and fairness were held in awe throughout the ancient Near East. The judicial actions attributed to Solomon did not only resolve the disputes of individuals, but also served as expressions of higher values, reinforcing both royal legitimacy and divine favor. This period is characterized by a heightened demand for law and order due to the complexities that came with a growing and diverse population. The increased intermingling of tribes, merchants, artisans, and foreign communities in Jerusalem and the surrounding territories introduced a new range of civil, economic, and social disputes that required resolution at the highest levels. It was during this context that Solomon's judicial capacity became legendary, with his most famous judgments echoing far beyond the borders of Israel. The most widely referenced judicial ruling is the account involving 2 women and a disputed child, a case that has been recited across cultures for its moral symbolism. According to the biblical record and traditional accounts, 2 women, living in the same dwelling and both having recently given birth, appeared before Solomon. One child had died during the night, and the surviving child was claimed by both women as their own. With no witnesses and no conclusive evidence, Solomon proposed a shocking solution. He called for a sword and declared that the child be divided in 2, giving half to each woman. In response, one of the women cried out in agony, begging that the child be spared and given to the other woman. The other woman remained unmoved, agreeing to the division. Solomon then identified the woman who showed compassion as the true mother, returning the child to her unharmed. This decision reverberated across the region, not only as an act of clever adjudication, but as a symbolic declaration that mercy and empathy are at the heart of true justice. Beyond this iconic event, Solomon's court became the setting for countless other judgments, many of which were rooted in economic disputes, land disagreements, labor conflicts, and family claims. As the kingdom grew more structured and administrative roles became increasingly defined, Solomon's ability to balance tribal traditions with emerging legal norms was critical to maintaining societal cohesion. His wisdom was not merely seen as a personal trait, but was interpreted as a divine gift, one that validated his rule and affirmed his relationship with the sacred order established by the God of Israel. In the broader context of the ancient Near East, Solomon's approach to judgment aligned with the larger regional tradition of wise kingship. Rulers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia were expected not only to lead in battle and construct monuments, but also to serve as the supreme arbitrators of justice. However, Solomon's model differed in its emphasis on personal involvement and discernment, rather than relying solely on scribes or delegated judges. He regularly presided over cases that carried symbolic significance or had the potential to disrupt communal harmony. His presence in these matters conveyed a message of active kingship and underscored the belief that the monarch served as the earthly channel of divine wisdom. Records and interpretations from this time suggest that Solomon also made efforts to institutionalize certain judicial procedures. While formal legal codes, such as those seen in Mesopotamia, are not explicitly documented from Solomon's reign, the consistency of judgment principles hints at a developing body of customary law. Property rights, inheritance disputes, agricultural boundaries, and worker compensation began to be treated with increasing uniformity. Solomon's judgments became precedents, not merely resolutions of individual cases, and this helped lay the foundation for a more structured judicial culture in later centuries. Religious institutions also played a significant role in the judicial system during this period. The temple in Jerusalem, having recently been completed, became not only a place of worship but also a space for legal oaths, testimonies, and trials involving sacred elements. Oaths were often made before the altar, with divine witness invoked to ensure truthfulness. In some cases, religious leaders acted as advisors or interpreters of the law, though ultimate authority remained with the king. The intertwining of legal and religious authority served to reinforce the perceived sanctity of justice and to elevate the consequences of false testimony or unethical conduct. One of the lesser-known but historically significant judgments from this period involved the conflict between landowners and shepherds over water access during times of drought. As agriculture and herding intensified, competition over wells and irrigation channels became more acute. Solomon is said to have established a rotating water-sharing system in certain regions, which allowed for equitable access based on the needs of crops, livestock, and community drinking supply. This judgment reflected both environmental awareness and social foresight, qualities rarely credited to monarchs of the ancient world, but evident in the historical memory of Solomon's reign. In addition to resolving domestic disputes, Solomon's court handled petitions from foreign residents and traveling merchants. The cosmopolitan nature of Jerusalem during this period required the king to act with sensitivity toward differing customs and commercial practices. Disputes involving caravan contracts, stolen goods, or broken trade promises were adjudicated with care to uphold Israel's reputation as a stable and just trading partner. These decisions contributed to the long-term trust between Jerusalem and its regional trading counterparts, a trust that translated into wealth and influence in subsequent decades. The first part of chapter 6, then, reveals a deeply layered picture of judicial life in ancient Israel. It was not only about settling arguments, but about shaping societal expectations, expressing moral values, and demonstrating that law was an extension of divine justice. Through wisdom and discernment, Solomon's judgments transformed his court into a beacon of stability in a time of growing complexity. The examples of his famous decisions endure not because of their immediate outcomes alone, but because they illustrated a philosophy of justice centered on empathy, fairness, and the sacred duty of leadership. As we continue into the second part of chapter 6, we will explore how Solomon's reputation for judicial wisdom spread beyond Israel's borders, how foreign leaders sought his counsel, and how the concept of wise rulership influenced the broader world during and after his reign. As the years passed in the reign of Solomon, the fame of his wisdom spread far beyond the borders of his own kingdom, carried by caravans crossing the desert sands, by ships hugging the coasts of the Mediterranean, and by emissaries sent from foreign courts, curious to know if the tales they had heard were true. His judgments were not only admired for their fairness and clarity, but also for their deep insight into the human condition, reflecting a ruler who could see past appearances and understand motives, fears, and desires that others might miss. News of his wisdom traveled northward through the lands of Syria and Phoenicia, eastward into the territories that once belonged to ancient Mesopotamia, and even as far as Egypt, where scribes recorded observations of distant rulers as part of their extensive chronicles. Solomon's ability to mediate disputes, not just within his own land, but between regional leaders and tribal chieftains, positioned him as more than a king. He became a figure of counsel and arbitration. His palace became not only a center of administration and ceremony, but also a kind of court of final appeal for those who could reach it. Foreign traders, diplomats, and even rival kings began to recognize that seeking Solomon's opinion on complex issues might lend their decisions greater legitimacy or moral weight. One well-preserved tradition tells of an envoy from a neighboring region who arrived with a dilemma that had baffled his own advisors. Two feuding clans, each powerful in their own right, were locked in a cycle of revenge over the ambiguous boundaries of ancestral grazing lands. Appeals to regional gods had failed. Sacrifices and mediation had changed nothing. When the emissary brought the dispute before Solomon, he listened carefully, but said nothing for a day. The next morning, he delivered his judgment. Instead of declaring a victor, he redefined the terms of ownership entirely. He proposed the creation of a neutral zone, with alternating seasonal use, overseen by shared stewards from both clans. It was not merely a legal judgment, it was a wise innovation, born from understanding both human pride and practical necessity. His decision diffused the tension and laid the foundation for lasting cooperation. Solomon's wisdom was not only used for resolving personal or tribal conflicts, it extended into areas of economic justice and administrative balance. He implemented structures ensuring that officials who abused power could be tried and removed, regardless of their rank. In one instance, recorded in oral tradition and passed down through scribes, a tax collector in the northern hill country had been accused of extorting beyond his assigned levies. The case was delicate, involving layers of local custom and conflicting testimonies. Rather than render a verdict based solely on written record or bureaucratic standing, Solomon personally interviewed the witnesses and examined patterns in the collector's ledgers. He noticed a discrepancy in the grain receipts during festival periods, which had not been reported by the scribe. From this small detail, he uncovered a scheme of hidden fees imposed upon the poor. His judgment restored the property unjustly taken, relieved the population of extra burdens, and sent a clear signal throughout the kingdom that no office was above scrutiny. What truly distinguished Solomon's judicial work, however, was not simply his rulings, but the manner in which he delivered them. Witnesses noted how he would often begin by asking unexpected questions, ones not directly tied to the case, but designed to reveal character and intention. He might ask a petitioner about the color of the sky on the morning of a quarrel, or the first words spoken before a deal turned sour. These questions, seemingly irrelevant, unsettled the dishonest and brought clarity to the truthful. His court became a theater of justice, where not only the facts but the hearts of men were revealed. Foreign rulers, intrigued by what they heard, began to send gifts, letters, and even envoys to learn from Solomon's method. Some came to observe quietly, sitting in the upper levels of his great hall, watching as he ruled not from a place of intimidation, but from one of calm and reason. Among those who arrived was an administrator from Tyre, fluent in the ways of Phoenician law, who carried back with him scrolls of Solomon's decisions to be studied in the port cities along the coast. A delegation from Sheba would come later, bringing with them not only wealth, but riddles designed to test whether the famed king's wisdom could match their cunning. Solomon, unshaken, answered each with humility and insight, impressing not only his guests but his own people, who had gathered to witness the exchange. Beyond mere admiration, some of Solomon's rulings began to influence legal practices abroad. In regions of southern Arabia, for instance, tribal elders began to introduce judgments that included compromise and delayed justice, echoing Solomon's understanding that not all truth reveals itself immediately. In parts of Aram and Moab, travelers reported the rise of neutral arbitration councils, inspired by the idea of balanced judgment rather than swift retaliation. Within his own kingdom, Solomon's wisdom became a unifying force, especially in times when tensions rose between the 12 tribes. There were times when the northern regions felt overlooked in temple matters centered around Jerusalem, or when the tribal leaders of Judah and Ephraim disagreed over land usage. Rather than issue decrees from a distance, Solomon would invite both parties to Jerusalem. He would listen to grievances in person, sometimes over several days, before offering a decision that, while not always pleasing to all, was at least respected as fair and thoughtfully rendered. His careful and consistent application of wisdom established a legal and ethical standard that continued to guide the nation long after his reign. As we near the close of this chapter, it becomes evident that Solomon's judicial legacy was not just about individual verdicts. It was about establishing a model of governance where wisdom and empathy were valued above power and punishment. He taught through action that justice was not only the application of law, but the careful navigation of human complexity. His ability to listen deeply, think clearly, and decide wisely made his court a model for other rulers and laid the groundwork for a vision of leadership that prioritized peace over pride. In the centuries that followed, when later generations spoke of justice, they did so with stories that began not with laws carved in stone, but with the example of a king who once sat upon a throne in Jerusalem and listened, questioned, and judged with a mind as sharp as it was compassionate. His judgments lived on, not only in scrolls and chronicles, but in the memory of a people who had once seen with their own eyes what it meant to be ruled by wisdom. And so concludes chapter 6, a chapter that revealed not merely the judicial decisions of King Solomon, but the spirit of wisdom that defined his reign, a spirit that echoed beyond borders, shaped nations, and still inspires the idea of justice in the hearts of many. Alliances, wives, and the Queen of Sheba takes us into the heart of Solomon's golden years, a time set around the year of 940, before the beginning of the Common Era. This chapter is one of diplomacy, and of power exchanged, not with swords or bloodshed, but with veils, vows, and gold-bound promises whispered across palace chambers and desert winds. It is here that we see the strength of Israel, not only in its walls and towers, but in its connections, in the delicate fabric of alliances woven through marriage, friendship, and the arrival of one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient legend, the Queen of Sheba. Solomon, son of David and Bathsheba, had already built a name for himself as a man of peace and wisdom. His kingdom did not expand by force as his father's had, but through influence, through brilliance, through diplomacy, and perhaps most famously, through marriage. Across the lands of Canaan, through the deserts of the south, and the great trade routes to the east, Solomon's court became known as a center of learning and splendor, but also as a court that welcomed kings and their daughters alike. Marriage in this ancient world was not always about love, and perhaps rarely about companionship. It was a tool, a thread in the loom of regional politics, and Solomon mastered its use with delicate precision. The chronicles and oral traditions of Israel tell of his many wives, and while some numbers seem symbolic or exaggerated through the centuries of retelling, the intent remains the same. Solomon's marriages were carefully chosen, bridges, pathways between his throne and the thrones of others. One of the most politically significant marriages Solomon formed was with the princess of Egypt, the daughter of a pharaoh whose name history has not firmly preserved. Egypt, proud and ancient, was not known for offering its daughters to foreign rulers. That this pharaoh gave his daughter to Solomon was a symbol of great respect, a political move that showed the rising power and legitimacy of the Israelite kingdom. The alliance was sealed with gifts of territory, including the city of Gezer, which Solomon received as part of the dowry and later rebuilt, adding to the fortified network that protected and connected his realm. This union with Egypt did more than bring land. It brought prestige. Egypt was the beacon of ancient civilization at that time. To be connected to its royal house was to be acknowledged by the longest-standing power in the region. It meant that Solomon's kingdom was no longer seen as a rugged hill people clinging to sacred stones. It meant they were players on the stage of history. But Solomon did not stop at Egypt. His alliances reached north to Phoenicia, east to Ammon and Moab, and south into the lands of Arabia and beyond. Every marriage brought with it new customs, new languages, and new gods, which would one day bring challenges. But in the time of Solomon, they brought commerce and security. Each wife brought with her not only beauty and royal blood, but also ambassadors, scribes, artisans, and the flowing tide of trade. The palace in Jerusalem, rich with the scent of cedar and the gleam of imported gold, was filled with the languages of many lands. There were dancers from Sidon, musicians from Damascus, perfumers from Saba, and builders from Tyre. The influence of foreign courts flowed through the halls like incense. The wisdom of Solomon, so often spoken of in hushed tones, was not merely in his knowledge of law or poetry, but in his understanding of people, of nations, of the delicate balance between autonomy and alliance. To the common people of Israel, these marriages may have felt distant and foreign, but the effects rippled outward in tangible ways. Markets grew richer, roads grew safer. The flow of spices, linen, metals, and even animals widened. Solomon's Jerusalem became not only a spiritual center, but an economic hub, a place where camels from Sheba and ships from Tarshish all found cause to stop and do business. However, with the swelling number of foreign wives came changes that were more than just economic. Each princess brought with her the gods of her homeland, and Solomon, ever diplomatic, allowed them to keep their customs. He built high places for their worship. He allowed temples and shrines outside of the traditional worship of Yahweh. At first, these were gestures of tolerance, signs of friendship, but the seeds of spiritual compromise had been sown. What was politically brilliant in the short term would one day challenge the very identity of the Israelite faith and nation. Still, in these early days, Solomon walked a fine line between reverence and strategy. His own faith remained firm, his court still centered around the temple he had built with the labor of thousands and the wealth of nations. And yet, the voices of foreign lands echoed just as loudly in the corridors of his palace. Some say this balance was his genius. Others say it was the beginning of his unraveling. Even as his alliances spread and the circle of his wives expanded, there remained one story, one visitor, one queen who stood apart from all others. A queen whose arrival was not born of marriage, but of curiosity, admiration, and possibly more. Her journey would come from far beyond the borders of the known world, across the hot sands and the endless trade routes of Arabia. Her name would echo for centuries, both in history and myth. She would not come bearing a treaty or a proposal. She would come bearing riddles. But before we speak of her, the Queen of Sheba, we must look again at the network Solomon had so carefully crafted. The alliances with Edom, sealed perhaps with royal children. The connections with Hiram of Tyre, strengthened through trade and temple construction. The slow but deliberate drawing together of peoples, once divided by mountains and belief, now standing beneath one banner, or at least looking to one court. Solomon's reign was not simply a reign of peace. It was a reign of management, of negotiation, of understanding how to draw enemies into the fold and turn rivals into allies. In this, his marriages were less romantic tales and more the careful clicks of a master strategist moving pieces on a vast and shifting board. His wives were queens, yes, but they were also emissaries, keys to doors that otherwise would have remained shut. In the warmth of his palace gardens, where fountains whispered and fig trees offered shade, Solomon would walk, surrounded by beauty and by burden. Each alliance brought a gift, each wife brought a legacy, and each choice made for peace in his day may have carried with it the cost for the days to come. As the sun set over the hills of Judah and the courtyards filled with songs in many tongues, Solomon's kingdom stood unchallenged. From Dan to Beersheba, from the sea to the desert, all was quiet. But on the horizon, a caravan approached. From the south, from beyond the deserts, from a land known for gold and frankincense, and questions with no easy answers. And that is where we will continue in part 2. Continuing from the end of part 1, we now explore in greater depth the extraordinary implications of Solomon's diplomatic strategies, royal marriages, and the legendary visit of the Queen of Sheba, all of which unfolded around 940 years before the Common Era. The visit of the Queen of Sheba marked a pivotal moment in ancient diplomacy. Her appearance at the court of Solomon was more than a meeting between two monarchs. It was a symbol of global curiosity, economic ambition, and the growing renown of Israel under Solomon's rule. While her journey has long been wrapped in legend, historical inquiry supports the idea that Sheba was a powerful kingdom, likely centered in southern Arabia, rich in natural resources and deeply engaged in the international trade networks that linked Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Her travel across unforgiving terrain to reach Jerusalem demonstrated not only her determination, but also the magnitude of Solomon's reputation as a sovereign of unmatched wisdom. She arrived not with an army, but with a convoy laden with goods, gold, ivory, perfumes, and precious stones, a statement of both wealth and respect. Her visit had a dual purpose, combining commercial interest with a philosophical challenge. She came to test Solomon's intellect with riddles and complex questions, an established tradition in royal courts of the ancient world. Solomon responded not as a conqueror, but as a scholar king. He answered her questions with clarity, revealed his knowledge of law, governance, and nature, and gave her insight into how justice and morality shaped his decisions. Their conversations, though only briefly documented in biblical records, must have encompassed deep exchanges on theology, trade, empire management, and the spiritual obligations of rulers. The visit also had far-reaching geopolitical consequences. Trade agreements likely emerged from this meeting, increasing the flow of luxury goods into Israel and cementing Israel's role as a key player in regional commerce. The introduction of Shebon goods, especially frankincense and myrrh, boosted the religious and ceremonial life of Jerusalem, while Israelite products such as grain, textiles, and metalworks may have found new markets in the south. Solomon's court thus became not only a spiritual center, but an economic and diplomatic powerhouse. Foreign emissaries followed the Queen of Sheba's example, seeking knowledge, negotiating trade, and observing the splendor of a city transformed by wise leadership. These encounters elevated Jerusalem's status and spread Solomon's fame across the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia to Egypt and beyond. The alliances Solomon forged through marriage also continued to shape the cultural fabric of his reign, with wives from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Phoenicia, and Egypt. Solomon's household was a reflection of his international strategy. These marriages were not driven by passion, but by political calculation. Each alliance strengthened peace treaties, opened new trade paths, and brought diplomatic recognition to Israel's growing influence. Foreign princesses often arrived with entire entourages, introducing new customs, languages, and artistic styles into Israelite society. While these influences enriched the cultural life of the kingdom, they also introduced challenges. The royal court became a place of religious plurality. Solomon allowed his foreign wives to maintain their traditional forms of worship, erecting shrines and altars to their gods. This accommodation, while politically expedient, stirred tensions among the Israelite priesthood and provoked concern among those who feared the dilution of Israel's covenant with Yahweh. These compromises did not immediately destabilize the kingdom, but they planted the seeds of future division. As the memory of Solomon's accomplishments faded in later generations, the religious concessions he made in the name of peace and diplomacy would become points of contention. Critics argued that he strayed from the purity of monotheistic worship, while defenders pointed to the wealth, peace, and stability his policies had created. Returning to the Queen of Sheba, her departure from Jerusalem was said to be as impactful as her arrival. She left with more than material gifts. She carried with her ideas, stories, and a renewed vision of rulership. According to Ethiopian tradition, her connection to Solomon bore lasting fruit in the birth of a son named Menelik. Though historical evidence for this lineage remains debated, the cultural significance is profound. Menelik was believed to have founded a dynasty that claimed descent from Solomon, blending African and Israelite royal traditions into a powerful national identity. For centuries, this story served as a foundation for the legitimacy of Ethiopian emperors, who traced their divine right to rule back to the House of David. This intertwining of myth and history reflects the broader legacy of Solomon's alliances. His name lived on not only through scripture, but through the royal lineages, religious reforms, and diplomatic traditions of many nations. He became a model of kingly wisdom, not just for Israelites, but for generations of leaders seeking to balance power with prudence. Solomon's court during this time was likely one of the most cosmopolitan environments of the ancient Near East. Scholars, artisans, traders, and priests from across the known world visited or resided in Jerusalem. The construction of the temple, the splendor of the palace, and the administration of a growing and diverse kingdom all contributed to the golden reputation of Solomon's reign. But within this golden age was a quiet tension, a growing complexity that would not be easy to manage indefinitely. The success of Solomon's marriages and foreign diplomacy depended on balance, wisdom, and the willingness of different communities to coexist. As long as Solomon's authority remained unchallenged, peace prevailed. But his successors would not enjoy the same level of respect or control, and the empire he built would face fragmentation. In retrospect, the visit of the Queen of Sheba stands as a symbolic high point in Solomon's reign. It encapsulated the potential of peaceful exchange, mutual admiration, and the blending of cultures. Her admiration for Solomon, and his hospitality in return, reflected a world in which wisdom could travel farther than armies, and where diplomacy could forge stronger bonds than conquest. In conclusion, Solomon's alliances and the visit of the Queen of Sheba remain among the most compelling elements of his legacy. They demonstrate the power of intellectual and diplomatic engagement, the importance of international relationships in the ancient world, and the complex role of foreign influence in shaping Israel's identity. His reign, around 940 years before the Common Era, was not only a period of prosperity and growth, but a chapter in world history that still resonates today, reminding us that true leadership often lies not in domination, but in dialogue. Idolatry and political challenges, circa 930 before the Common Era, the erosion of devotion and the seeds of division. As we continue our quiet journey through the life and reign of King Solomon, we now arrive at a somber turning point, chapter less gilded than those before it. yet profoundly important in understanding the full arc of his legacy. In Chapter 8, Decline, Idolatry and Political Challenges, we begin to trace the slow, creeping descent of a kingdom that once basked in divine favor and unparalleled unity. This period, beginning around 930 before the Common Era, marks the twilight of Solomon's golden age, and the quiet unraveling of the threads he had so carefully woven throughout his long and prosperous reign. The man who once stood as a paragon of wisdom, who built a temple to the one true God, and who had secured peace through diplomacy and discernment, was now facing the greatest test of his life, one not imposed from without, but born from within. The seeds of decline were not sown in a single day, nor did they sprout suddenly. They took root over many years, nourished by the gradual drift of Solomon's heart, and the political burdens of managing an empire whose vastness had become both a source of strength and a source of strain. At the heart of this decline was a spiritual shifter move away from the singular devotion to the God of Israel that had defined the early years of Solomon's rule. In those earlier times, Solomon had walked in the ways of his father David, honoring the covenant and seeking divine guidance. But with time, his affections became divided, shaped by the many alliances he had forged through marriage, and the influences those unions brought into the royal court. The pursuit of peace through diplomatic marriage, though successful in its political aims, came with spiritual consequences that would not become fully apparent until much later in his life. Solomon had taken many wives, 700, the scriptures claim, with 300 concubines. In addition, these marriages were often strategic, uniting Israel with neighboring kingdoms and distant powers, from Egypt to Moab, from Ammon to Sidon, and even from lands as far off as Hatti and Cush. These women brought with them their cultures, their customs, and their gods. At first, these foreign deities were tolerated quietly, their shrines and symbols appearing at the periphery of Jerusalem's spiritual life. But soon, Solomon himself began to indulge in their worship, perhaps to honor his wives, perhaps to maintain harmony in his household, or perhaps as the years passed and the vigor of youth faded, out of a desire to please more than to rule. Thus, Solomon, once a champion of monotheism, now presided over a court that allowed the worship of Astarte, Milcom, Chemosh, and Molech. The high places, once purged by reformers and prophets, returned in secret and then in public. Temples were built not only for the God of Israel, but for the gods of foreign lands. Sacred groves were planted, incense burned, and sacrifices offered not only on behalf of others, but at times by Solomon himself. The dissonance between his early faith and later practices became increasingly evident to those within the court and throughout the kingdom. This spiritual drift did not go unnoticed by the prophets and priests, nor by the people. The discontent was whispered first in marketplaces, then in temples, and soon in the tribal councils. The sense of divine favor that had once seemed to wrap Jerusalem in golden light now began to flicker. Questions were raised about the king's judgment, his priorities, and whether the God who had delivered Israel from Egypt would continue to bless a nation so divided in its loyalties. And yet, the challenges of this period were not merely religious, they were deeply political as well. The kingdom of Israel, under Solomon, had become a centralized and bureaucratic state. Taxes were high to support the grandeur of the temple, the palace, and the vast infrastructure projects undertaken during his reign. Forced labor, once used for noble building efforts, began to feel burdensome to many of the tribes. The northern regions, in particular tribes like Ephraim and Manasseh, felt increasingly marginalized by a court that seemed to favor Judah and Benjamin. As Solomon aged, these tensions began to ferment into resentment. His administration, filled with loyal officials and palace elites, grew out of touch with the rural concerns of the people. While trade routes flourished and wealth flowed into Jerusalem, the burdens on farmers, craftsmen, and laborers intensified. What had once been a kingdom united by prosperity now teetered on the edge of division, held together less by affection and more by the weight of royal authority. It was during this time that opposition began to stir quietly at first, then with greater boldness. One figure who emerged from this unrest was Jeroboam, a talented and ambitious administrator from the tribe of Ephraim, appointed by Solomon to oversee the labor force in the northern territories. Jeroboam witnessed firsthand the growing dissatisfaction among the people. Though loyal at the outset, he began to question the direction of the kingdom and the wisdom of a king who no longer seemed to embody the values he once championed. According to later tradition, it was a prophet named Ahijah who foretold the division of the kingdom, clearing that 10 tribes would eventually break away, leaving only Judah and Benjamin under the house of David. This prophecy, shared in private with Jeroboam, marked a pivotal moment in Israel's history. Though the split would not occur in Solomon's lifetime, the fractures were already forming, invisible to some, but deeply felt by those who sensed the spirit of unity slipping away. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Solomon may have sensed the shifting winds. His later writings, often attributed to the Book of Ecclesiastes, reflect a tone of melancholy introspection. Phrases like "vanity of vanities" and "all is vanity" suggest a ruler grappling with the impermanence of power, the futility of wealth, and the burden of wisdom, no longer the vibrant king who asked only for discernment. Solomon in his later years appeared weary, worn down, not only by age, but by the cumulative weight of his choices. And still, the kingdom endured for the moment. Jerusalem remained a city of splendor, and the temple still stood as a symbol of Israel's covenant with the divine. But beneath the surface, beneath the gold and cedar, cracks had begun to form, spiritual cracks, political fissures, and the slow erosion of a vision that had once united 12 tribes into one people. As we pause here, at the close of part 1 of chapter 8, we do not yet witness the fall, but we feel its approach. In the next and final part of this chapter, we will continue to explore the consequences of Solomon's decline, the challenges that followed his death, the fulfillment of prophetic warnings, and the permanent division of the kingdom that would reshape the course of Israel's history. The era of peace was ending. The age of judgment was near. Now we continue from the end of part 1. By the time Solomon's reign entered its final decade, the kingdom of Israel, once unified and admired for its splendor and administrative efficiency, had begun to erode from within. While his earlier years were marked by international diplomacy, trade networks, monumental architecture, and centralized religious authority, the later period was increasingly characterized by division, spiritual compromise, and political instability. The decline was neither sudden nor caused by a single event, but emerged as a result of complex, interlocking factors. Most prominently, Solomon's tolerance of idolatry and the internal backlash it provoked. Idolatry and religious fragmentation. One of the most significant factors in Solomon's decline was the rapid and unprecedented proliferation of foreign religious practices within the kingdom. These practices were introduced primarily through Solomon's vast network of diplomatic marriages. According to biblical accounts, he maintained hundreds of wives and concubines, many of them foreign princesses from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and Egypt. Each of these marriages often came with accompanying religious concessions. Temples, shrines, and high places were constructed to accommodate the deities of Solomon's foreign wives, including Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, Chemosh of Moab, and Molech of the Ammonites. These developments were not merely tolerated by Solomon, they were authorized and, in many cases, sponsored. This stood in sharp contrast to the centralization of Yahweh worship earlier in his reign, particularly the grand dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, which was intended to be the singular place of worship for all Israel. By allowing and facilitating these rival Celtic practices, Solomon effectively undermined the theological unity that had underpinned much of his earlier legitimacy. The religious shift also created confusion and division among the population. The people of Israel, who had been commanded to worship only Yahweh and avoid foreign gods, now found their king actively participating in, or at the very least endorsing, idolatrous practices. This eroded trust in royal authority and disillusioned the priesthood and prophetic voices that had once championed the Davidic line as divinely sanctioned. Reaction and prophetic condemnation. The spiritual disunity did not go unchallenged. According to later traditions, prophets began to speak out against the corruption that had infected the kingdom. Though these prophetic voices are not extensively detailed in the historical record from Solomon's time, later texts reflect a strong tradition of denunciation against syncretism and idolatry, viewing this period as a fundamental betrayal of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel. The prophets, likely marginalized during Solomon's rule, would have viewed the king's actions not merely as personal failings, but as national transgressions with political consequences. The introduction of foreign gods was not seen as a private matter of belief, but as a public rejection of divine law, spiritual treason that would invite judgment, fragmentation, and eventual exile. Administrative and political repercussions. Solomon's religious compromises had direct administrative consequences. The previously centralized religious authority that had been rooted in Jerusalem and the temple began to weaken, with multiple centers of worship emerging, often on high places scattered across the kingdom. The symbolic and practical unity of the state fractured. Each shrine built to honor a foreign deity represented a point of decentralization, not only in religion but in political loyalty. At the same time, the financial demands of maintaining these multiple cultic sites added to the strain on royal resources. The construction and upkeep of foreign temples, combined with the already heavy cost of Solomon's palace complex, government bureaucracy, and standing army, pushed the kingdom's economy to its limits. Taxation increased, particularly in the northern tribes, whose agricultural wealth was crucial for the sustenance of the court. The use of labor mandatory state service, often unpaid, also intensified. While tolerated in the early years of the monarchy, these burdens grew increasingly resented over time, particularly as the benefits of state projects appeared to flow primarily to Jerusalem and the southern elite. Rise of regional resentment. The increasing centralization of power and wealth in Judah, particularly in Jerusalem, caused a growing divide between the northern and southern tribes. The northern territories, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, and others, bore much of the economic burden, but received little political influence or symbolic representation. With the rise of foreign cults, often located within or near the capital, the northern tribal regions found themselves both economically exploited and religiously alienated. This resentment created fertile ground for opposition movements, both passive and active. While no open rebellion occurred during Solomon's reign, signs of political tension were already visible. Local leaders began asserting more autonomy, and tribal identities, long suppressed under the centralized monarchy, began to re-emerge with renewed strength. This internal discontent would eventually coalesce around charismatic opposition figures, one of whom, Jeroboam, was already rising to prominence by the late years of Solomon's reign. Although his rebellion would take place after Solomon's death, the roots of his movement were planted in the disenchantment of these final decades. Foreign challenges and loss of regional influence. While domestic unrest simmered, Solomon's once dominant foreign policy began to falter. The extensive network of alliances that had secured peace and prosperity earlier in his reign began to show signs of instability. Egypt, once a reliable partner, was growing more independent in its regional diplomacy. Edom and Aram, Syria, previously subdued through military and diplomatic measures, began to reassert their autonomy. One significant foreign challenge arose from Hadad, the Edomite, who, according to the biblical record, had fled to Egypt during David's campaigns and returned during Solomon's reign to stir unrest in Edom. Another figure, Rezon of Zobah, established himself in Damascus and became a persistent threat to Israel's northern border. These foreign adversaries were not merely military concerns. They reflected Solomon's weakening grip on the geopolitical order he had once so skillfully manipulated. The loss of control over key trade routes, buffer states, and allied territories meant a decline not only in revenue but in regional prestige. Israel's image as an invincible, blessed nation was fading, both at home and abroad. Theological interpretation of decline. Later, historiographical traditions, particularly those preserved in the Deuteronomistic history, interpret the decline of Solomon's reign not as an inevitable political development, but as the direct consequence of divine displeasure. From this theological perspective, Solomon's apostasy, his turning away from Yahweh to worship other gods, was the pivotal act that sealed the fate of the unified monarchy. In this view, the internal and external challenges faced by Israel during the latter years of Solomon's reign were not merely natural outcomes of overreach or administrative mismanagement, but divine judgments intended to correct or punish the nation. The loss of unity, the rise of adversaries, and the eventual division of the kingdom after Solomon's death were seen as fulfillments of prophetic warnings. This religious interpretation would shape how future generations understood monarchy, kingship, and divine favor. It embedded the notion that faithfulness to Yahweh was not only a matter of personal piety, but a requirement for national survival and political coherence. Prelude to By the end of Solomon's 40-year reign, the kingdom of Israel was, on the surface, still whole. The temple stood in Jerusalem, the court remained wealthy, and no civil war had yet erupted. but the deeper structures that held the kingdom together, spiritual unity, tribal cooperation, economic balance, and prophetic legitimacy, had all been severely undermined. The idolatry, allowed under Solomon's rule, had not merely introduced new religious practices, it had broken a national covenant. The political system, once supported by shared beliefs and mutual obligations, had become brittle. The king, who was once seen as a bridge between the divine and the people, now appeared distant, burdened by luxury, detached from tradition, and isolated in his palace. The political challenges now facing the kingdom were not confined to administration, they were existential. The question was not only whether Solomon could maintain control, but whether the kingdom itself could survive the deepening divisions his reign had provoked. And as the year 930 BCE approached the traditional dating for Solomon's death, the storm clouds gathered silently over a kingdom unaware of how near it stood to fracture. King Solomon's enemies and rebellion circa 931 BCE. As the twilight of Solomon's reign approached, the grandeur that had once defined the kingdom of Israel began to fade, giving way to a turbulent era of discontent, division, and defiance. The year, circa 931 BCE, would be remembered not for monumental construction or diplomatic success, but for the unraveling of a once glorious kingdom, sparked by internal fractures and external pressures. This chapter examines the historical circumstances that culminated in widespread rebellion against King Solomon, the rise of foreign and domestic adversaries, and the political fragmentation that redefined the landscape of ancient Israel. The strains of excess and oppression, Solomon's ambitious policies of centralization, heavy taxation, and forced labor had already begun to sow seeds of unrest throughout the kingdom. While Jerusalem flourished as the center of religious and political life, much of the rural population bore the burden of imperial ambition. The lavish construction of the temple and royal palace, though celebrated by later chroniclers, had exacted a heavy toll on the populace. The northern tribes, in particular, felt alienated from the central administration. This growing regional imbalance fostered resentment that would soon erupt into open rebellion. The forced labor system, what biblical sources refer to as the had once been used to build Solomon's famed infrastructure. However, by the end of his reign, this policy no longer seemed a necessary act of state-building, but rather an oppressive mechanism of exploitation. Labor conscription and fiscal levies fell disproportionately on non-Judite regions, especially the northern tribes. Even among loyalists, questions began to surface. How long could the kingdom sustain this level of pressure on its people? How far could royal authority reach before it shattered the fragile unity among the tribes? Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The embodiment of rebellion at the center of the storm was Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zereda, whose political and administrative competence had initially earned him favor in Solomon's court. Entrusted with overseeing the labor force of the house of Joseph, Jeroboam quickly gained popularity among the northern tribes. He was charismatic, industrious, and most critically a voice for the grievances of the marginalized. Jeroboam's rise was not simply a result of ambition. It was the inevitable emergence of a challenger in a society where fault lines had deepened with every royal decree. The prophet Ahijah of Shiloh would play a pivotal role in transforming Jeroboam from administrator to revolutionary. In a symbolic act, Ahijah tore his cloak into 12 pieces, offering 10 to Jeroboam as a divine sign that the kingdom would be divided. This act, recorded in the biblical first book of Kings, was not merely prophetic theater, it was a bold declaration of imminent rupture. The religious significance of this prophecy intertwined with the political reality, framing rebellion as not only justified but divinely ordained. Aware of Jeroboam's growing influence, Solomon sought to eliminate him, forcing Jeroboam to flee into exile in Egypt. Pharaoh Shishak, also known as Shishonkai, who had assumed power around this time, welcomed the exiled rebel, a decision that not only reflected Egypt's strategic interests, but also signaled the beginning of a broader realignment of regional power. The role of Egypt in the shifting geopolitical landscape. By the early 10th century BCE, Egypt had regained a degree of strength under the 22nd dynasty, led by Pharaoh Shishak. Unlike his predecessors, Shishak demonstrated a keen interest in Levantian politics, and his harboring of Jeroboam must be understood within the context of regional power dynamics. Egypt, long a dominant force in the region, had observed Israel's rise under Solomon with cautious skepticism. Solomon's trade alliances, military fortifications, and political marriages had consolidated a formidable kingdom, potentially challenging Egyptian influence. Shishak's decision to provide asylum to Jeroboam was both a political statement and a tactical maneuver. It allowed Egypt to undermine Israelite unity without direct confrontation, and created a proxy through whom Egyptian interests could be advanced. Jeroboam's presence in Egypt would later prove pivotal when he returned to Israel after Solomon's death, leading the charge in the formation of the northern kingdom, Hadad the Edomite, and the resurgence of local rivals. Jeroboam was not the only adversary Solomon had to contend with. Another significant threat came from Hadad the Edomite, a royal of Edom who had fled to Egypt during David's military campaigns. As chronicled in the Hebrew Bible, Hadad grew up in exile but never abandoned his desire to reclaim his homeland and oppose Israelite dominance. The Edomites, long subjugated under Israelite control, saw Solomon's weakening grip as an opportunity to assert their independence. Hadad's return to Edom signaled a broader trend, the revival of neighboring powers that had once been subdued under David's military conquests. Solomon's reign, though marked by peace and prosperity for much of its duration, did not include the same level of territorial control or military engagement. This passive foreign policy may have allowed vassal states and former enemies to regroup and resist. The Edomite resistance under Hadad was less about large-scale warfare and more about strategic disruption. Edomite raiding parties, border skirmishes, and diplomatic maneuvering challenged Israelite hegemony in the south. Solomon's response, constrained by internal unrest and diminishing resources, was limited and ineffective. Hadad's persistent hostility demonstrated that Solomon's enemies were not merely theoretical threats, they were tangible actors, reclaiming lost ground. Rezon of Damascus and the rise of Aramean power, another formidable adversary, emerged in the north. Rezon, son of Eliada, a fugitive from Zobah, who established himself as the ruler of Damascus. Rezon's rebellion marked the ascendancy of Aramean power in Syria, a development that would reshape the geopolitical map of the Levant in subsequent decades. His kingdom became a hub of anti-Israelite resistance, drawing disaffected groups and challenging Israel's control over northern trade routes. Rezon's rise was emblematic of a broader trend in the ancient Near East, the resurgence of local polities capitalizing on Israel's internal divisions, like Hadad. In the south, Rezon's activities were aimed not at open conquest, but at weakening Solomon's influence. His raids into Israelite territory, disruption of trade caravans, and consolidation of Aramean identity would reverberate long after Solomon's death. Internal fractures and the limits of centralized authority, while external enemies gained strength. Internal discontent continued to fester. The 12 tribes of Israel, never fully unified even during David's reign, now found themselves increasingly divided along economic, geographic, and political lines. Jerusalem, as the epicenter of royal power, often appeared disconnected from the realities faced by distant tribal regions. The wisdom that had once defined Solomon's leadership now seemed overshadowed by administrative rigidity and spiritual deviation. The imposition of administrative districts that disregarded traditional tribal boundaries only exacerbated this tension. Designed to streamline governance and taxation, these districts inadvertently eroded tribal identities and loyalties. Many Israelites saw the move as an affront to their ancestral heritage, a top-down imposition of order that disrespected local autonomy. Moreover, the royal court's increasing opulence and its foreign influences, most notably from Solomon's many political marriages, alienated segments of the population who saw these developments as a betrayal of Israelite tradition. The introduction of foreign religious practices, already discussed in the previous chapter, deepened the chasm between the monarchy and the religious elite, particularly the prophets and Levites. Prophetic voices and the crisis of legitimacy as political authority weakened and external threats multiplied. Prophetic voices grew louder. The prophets did not merely critique policy, they challenged the very legitimacy of the monarchy. They portrayed Solomon's failures not as mere miscalculations, but as moral and spiritual failures. The prophetic critique framed the national crisis as divine judgment, a response to idolatry, injustice, and the abandonment of the covenant. In this atmosphere, the rebellion was not merely a political movement, it became a theologically charged uprising. Jeroboam's eventual return from Egypt would carry with it the weight of prophetic endorsement, offering the northern tribes a morally justified alternative to the Davidic monarchy. Conclusion: a kingdom on the brink. By the time Solomon's reign drew to a close in circa 931 BCE, the kingdom of Israel stood at a crossroads. Once a beacon of unity and prosperity, it had become a fractious state beset by internal dissent and external aggression. The enemies that rose against Solomon, Jeroboam, Gadad, Hizong, were not isolated threats, but symbols of deeper structural and spiritual crises. This period of rebellion and resistance set the stage for the dramatic events that followed Solomon's death: the division of the kingdom, the emergence of Israel and Judah as separate entities, and the long turbulent history that would follow. In examining the enemies and rebellions of this era, we do not merely witness the fall of a king, we glimpse the transformation of a nation. The twilight of Solomon's rule was not marked by a single event, but by a cascade of challenges that exposed the vulnerabilities of centralized power. And as the dust settled, a new chapter in Israelite history began, one shaped not by golden wisdom, but by division, struggle, and the enduring question of faith and leadership in the ancient world. Solomon's death and the aftermath, circa 931 before the Common Era, the end of the Golden Age. Now we continue from the end of chapter 9. As the last embers of Solomon's political reign cooled, and the torch of his influence began to flicker, the Israelite kingdom stood on the precipice of irreversible transformation. The death of King Solomon in approximately 931 before the Common Era marked not only the end of a sovereign's life, but also the termination of a united centralized Israelite monarchy that had been held together by sheer wisdom, grandeur, and divine appointment. Solomon's passing ushered in a period of monumental transition. With his burial in the city of David in Jerusalem, the very heart of the kingdom he had elevated to international prominence, a new chapter began, one marked by fragmentation, internal rebellion, spiritual conflict, and the collapse of the ideals that had once defined the house of David. Solomon's final years, a portrait of decline. In his final years, Solomon's court had become a palace of contradiction. On the surface, the capital city gleamed with the brilliance of cedarwood palaces, golden ornaments, and the famed temple, but beneath the grandeur lay deep spiritual compromise and political instability. The very ruler who had once received divine wisdom had slowly drifted into spiritual complacency, constructing shrines and altars to foreign gods to appease his numerous foreign wives and allies. According to the biblical text, Solomon maintained a harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of whom came from surrounding nations such as Egypt, Moab, Edom, Sidon, and Ammon. These unions were not simply romantic or indulgent. They were politically motivated, designed to create alliances with foreign powers. Yet, the unintended consequence was the introduction and normalization of idolatry within the highest echelons of Israelite society. The unity of religious devotion to Yahweh, which had defined the early monarchy, gave way to a pluralistic and diluted religious environment. Prophets and priests who had once revered Solomon's temple began to murmur concerns over the king's spiritual loyalty. As his attention splintered and his piety waned, so too did the unity of the people. The nation that had once come together in awe to dedicate the temple now found itself questioning the legitimacy of its spiritual leadership. Economic strain and social discontent. Solomon's ambitious building projects had not come without cost. To fund the lavish temple, royal palaces, fortresses, and chariot cities, Solomon had instituted a complex and heavy system of taxation and forced labor. While Jerusalem thrived and became a hub of economic activity, many rural tribes, particularly in the north, bore the brunt of these imperial policies. The discontent among the northern tribes grew steadily. Regions such as Ephraim, Issachar, and Zebulun increasingly felt alienated from the centralized government in Jerusalem. Their resources were being drained to maintain the capital's splendor, and their voices carried little influence within the king's court. What had once been celebrated as unity under David and Solomon had devolved into political imbalance and rising resentment. The rise of Rehoboam and the breaking of the kingdom upon Solomon's death. His son Rehoboam was named successor. Unlike Solomon, Rehoboam lacked the vision, charisma, and wisdom necessary to maintain the fragile balance his father had orchestrated. His coronation took place in Shechem, not Jerusalem, a clear signal that the northern tribes were asserting their influence in the transition of power. When representatives from the 12 tribes met Rehoboam, led by the returning exile Jeroboam, they posed a simple but vital request: lightened the yoke that Solomon had placed upon them. It was not a demand for revolution, but a plea for reform. Rehoboam sought counsel. The elders, men who had served under Solomon, advised moderation. They encouraged the new king to win the hearts of the people through empathy and compromise. However, Rehoboam ultimately rejected their wisdom and embraced the counsel of his younger peers, who advised him to assert greater dominance. His infamous response: "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." This decision proved catastrophic. 10 of the 12 tribes rebelled, rejecting Rehoboam's authority and crowning Jeroboam as king over the new northern kingdom of Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, forming the southern kingdom of Judah. The dream of a unified Israel, so painstakingly built under David and Solomon, was shattered within a single generation. The northern kingdom under Jeroboam, once an official in Solomon's administration, now stood as king of the 10 tribes. To solidify his rule, he instituted strategic religious reforms intended to sever the people's loyalty to Jerusalem. He established alternate worship centers at Bethel and Dan, where golden calves were erected as visible symbols of national identity. Though politically shrewd, these actions deepened the theological divide between the two kingdoms and were denounced by prophets as acts of idolatry. Jeroboam's reign set the tone for the northern kingdom's spiritual trajectory, one marked by cycles of syncretism, apostasy, and eventual prophetic condemnation. Though the kingdom would achieve moments of prosperity, its foundation rested on rebellion and religious deviation. The southern kingdom and the legacy of Solomon. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Rehoboam struggled to consolidate power. Though the temple remained and the Davidic line continued, the southern kingdom was reduced in size, influence, and economic strength. The division left Judah vulnerable to external threats. Egypt, under Pharaoh Shushan-Kai, took advantage of the internal instability and invaded Judah within 5 years of Solomon's death, looting treasures from the temple and palace, an ominous sign of declining international stature. The once mighty kingdom now stood as two weakened states, frequently at odds, and increasingly susceptible to the rising empires around them. The prophetic response: the division of the kingdom catalyzed a new era of prophetic activity. Figures such as Ahijah, Elijah, and later Isaiah and Hosea would rise to address the failures of both monarchies. These prophets served as voices of divine accountability, calling kings and people alike to return to covenantal faithfulness. Solomon's legacy became a focal point in these prophetic messages. His wisdom and achievements were remembered, but so too were his failings. The prophets used his story as both a warning and a call for repentance. The temple, while still revered, could no longer serve as a guarantee of divine favor. True faithfulness was required, not merely ritual, cultural and theological reverberations. Despite the fragmentation, the memory of Solomon's kingdom endured in Israelite consciousness. His wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs was preserved, studied, and cherished. The temple he built remained the central focus of Jewish worship until its destruction centuries later, and the longing for a reunified kingdom under a righteous Davidic king became a core hope, later embodied in messianic expectations. The aftermath of Solomon's death left Israel with unresolved tensions, between unity and division, between divine favor and judgment, and between monarchy and prophetic truth. His reign had touched the pinnacle of human achievement, but his decline exposed the dangers of spiritual compromise and unchecked power. Conclusion: the shadow and the legacy. Solomon died in approximately 931 before the Common Era, leaving behind a legacy that was both dazzling and tragic. He was a king of peace whose reign ended in division, a man of wisdom who succumbed to folly, a builder of the temple who also built high places to foreign gods. His death marked the end of Israel's golden age and the beginning of a more fragmented, tumultuous history. The united monarchy would never be restored. The two kingdoms would face invasion, exile, and destruction. Yet from the ashes of Solomon's fall would rise new understandings of covenant, justice, and faith, carried forward not by kings, but by prophets, scribes, and a people resilient in hope. Thus ends Chapter 10, Solomon's Death and the Aftermath, circa 931 before the Common Era, a chapter that does not close with triumph, but with transformation. For though Solomon was laid to rest in the city he adorned, the kingdom he ruled would never again be the same. And yet, the story of Israel was far from over. A new era had begun, one shaped, not by the splendor of monarchy, but by the enduring struggle for faith, justice, and identity. With the end of chapter 10, Solomon's death, and the aftermath, c. 931 BC, we bring to a close the complete historical account of King Solomon, son of David, monarch of Israel, and one of the most complex rulers of the ancient world. What began with a quiet rise to power in the shadow of his father's military and spiritual legacy, unfolded across a reign marked by divine favor, political brilliance, cultural achievement, and eventual spiritual decline. To summarize the life and reign of Solomon is to step carefully through a landscape of ambition, wisdom, devotion, diplomacy, and downfall, all elements that were explored throughout the 10 detailed chapters of this historical documentary. In Chapter 1, we examined the circumstances of Solomon's birth and early life, tracing his origins to the royal house of David in Bathsheba, though not initially a primary contender for the throne. Solomon's birth was marked by prophetic promise and divine favor. His early years were shaped by court politics, religious prophecy, and the tutelage of figures such as the prophet Nathan. This foundation would be crucial to the emergence of his later authority. Chapter 2 explored Solomon's rise to kingship, set against the backdrop of dynastic struggle, Adonijah's attempted coup, the subtle influence of Bathsheba, and the wise counsel of Nathan created the conditions for Solomon's unexpected coronation. The consolidation of power was swift and, at times, ruthless, including the removal of rivals and the execution or exile of those who threatened the young king's fragile authority. In Chapter 3, we turn to the most famous aspect of Solomon's legacy, the divine gift of wisdom. After offering sacrifices at Gibeon, Solomon experienced a revelatory dream in which God offered him anything he desired. Choosing wisdom above riches or long life, Solomon's request pleased the deity, and in response, he was granted not only discernment, but also wealth and honor unparalleled among his contemporaries. The chapter highlighted the role of divine favor in shaping Solomon's identity as a Chapter 4 centered on Solomon's most ambitious construction project, the building of the first temple in Jerusalem. This structure, completed over 7 years using skilled labor and vast materials sourced through regional alliances, became the spiritual heart of Israel. Solomon's palace complex, the Hall of Judgment, and other architectural endeavors demonstrated the king's commitment to statecraft, sacred space, and the visual language of centralized power. The chapter detailed the significance of architecture in solidifying religious and royal legitimacy. In Chapter 5, we explored Solomon's economic and diplomatic network, emphasizing his role as a regional power broker. Trade routes were established or expanded. Partnerships with Phoenician cities like Tyre brought in valuable resources, and the port city of Ezion-Geber opened trade to the Red Sea and beyond. The accumulation of wealth during Solomon's reign, including tribute from surrounding kingdoms, elevated Jerusalem as a cosmopolitan center of influence. This period marked the height of Israel's territorial and economic power. Chapter 6 focused on judicial wisdom. It included the famous story of the 2 women claiming the same child, a case in which Solomon's clever suggestion to divide the infant exposed the true mother through her compassion. This and other rulings reinforced his reputation as a fair and insightful judge, capable of discerning truth through human behavior rather than legal technicality. Justice, under Solomon, was both a personal performance and a societal pillar. Chapter 7 delved into Solomon's extensive alliances through marriage, most notably his union with an Egyptian princess and the famed encounter with the Queen of Sheba. These relationships served both symbolic and strategic purposes, expanding Israel's diplomatic reach and confirming Solomon's stature across continents. The Queen of Sheba's visit not only brought tribute, but also international recognition of Solomon's fame. The chapter illustrated how marriage and reputation became tools of geopolitical diplomacy. In Chapter 8, we examined the beginning of Solomon's decline, marked by religious syncretism and the erosion of Yahweh-centered worship. The presence of foreign wives and their gods began to reshape Jerusalem's spiritual landscape. High places and shrines appeared throughout the land, violating earlier religious reforms and angering traditionalists. Political challenges intensified as loyalty among tribes weakened and criticism of royal policy grew. This chapter emphasized the consequences of spiritual compromise and centralization. Chapter 9 covered the period of rebellion and external opposition. Figures such as Hadad, the Edomite, Rezon of Damascus, and Jeroboam of Ephraim rose in open or covert defiance of Solomon's regime. These individuals, motivated by personal grievance or political vision, found fertile ground among the discontented. The chapter highlighted how Solomon's iron-fisted centralization, heavy taxation, and spiritual deviations led to deep fractures within the kingdom. His reign, once secure, became a theater of unrest. Finally, in chapter 10, we explored Solomon's death and the fragile transition that followed. After 40 years of rule, Solomon passed away around 931 BCE, and the kingdom passed to his son Rehoboam. However, the tensions seeded during Solomon's final years quickly escalated. Rehoboam's harsh policies and unwillingness to address popular grievances led to the northern tribe secession. This schism marked the formal division of the once unified kingdom into two: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This 10-part historical documentary has thus covered the entire arc of Solomon's life, from hopeful beginnings to the powerful zenith of his reign, and finally to the divisions that followed his death. His legacy remains complex. He was a king of great wisdom, but not always of great foresight, a builder of temples, but also of burdens, a judge of disputes, but also the source of national discontent, a man who conversed with God, but who later bowed to foreign idols. Solomon's name endures across cultures among Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. His life has inspired texts, tales, legends, and lessons across thousands of years. Yet beyond myth and memory lies the historical Solomon, a figure situated in a turbulent ancient Near East, who rose to power through politics and prophecy, ruled with brilliance and boldness, and ultimately watched his unified kingdom fray at the edges before the close of his life. Through this complete video, the entire story of King Solomon boring history for sleep, we have traveled through nearly a century of historical transformation, theological evolution, and political drama, all conveyed in quiet, steady tones meant to inform without disturbing, to engage while soothing. May this historical account have not only provided a deeper understanding of Solomon's reign, but also served as a gentle companion in the quiet hours of rest. And so, the story concludes. From the ancient hills of Jerusalem to the legendary halls of Solomon's temple, from whispered prophecies to thunderous judgments, from wisdom divinely given to wisdom ultimately forgotten, this has been the entire story of King Solomon.